a billionaire CEO, stood in the middle of her own lobby, surrounded by six-figure specialists, and she was completely falling apart. Her son was on the marble floor, screaming so hard his whole body shook. Doctors crouched beside him. Therapists spoke in calm, trained voices. A behavioral specialist was attempting a technique that had worked on hundreds of children. It was not working on Leo. Victoria Sinclair, worth $4 billion, feared by competitors, admired by shareholders, could not help her child. She would have burned every dollar she owned to make it stop. Then the maintenance man set down his toolbox. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one is going to stay with you. The elevator in Hargrove Tower had been making a sound for 3 days. Not a dramatic sound. Not the kind that made people freeze and stare at the ceiling. It was low and rhythmic, almost like breathing. A tired groan buried somewhere inside the cable system that most people never noticed because they were too busy checking their phones and thinking about meetings that started in 4 minutes. Caleb Dawson noticed it on Tuesday. He was in the service corridor on sublevel 2 when he felt the vibration shift under his boots. Not heard it, felt it. That was the difference between someone who worked in a building and someone who actually knew one. Caleb knew Hargrove Tower the way some men know a car they've driven for years. Not just the parts they could name, but the sounds that didn't belong. The rhythms that were slightly off, the small warnings that always came before the big failures. By Thursday morning, he had already ordered the replacement part, logged the work ticket, and scheduled the repair for a window that would cause the minimum amount of disruption. Nobody had asked him to do any of that. Nobody even knew he'd done it. That was generally how Caleb operated. He was 32 years old, 6 years at Hargrove Tower. Before that, a hospital complex across town. Before that, an office park near the suburbs where he'd taken whatever steady work he could find because steady work was the only kind that mattered when you had a 4-year-old at home and no one to share the weight with. His badge said Maintenance, Caleb D. He wore it on the left breast pocket of his gray work shirt every day without thinking about it. The same way he wore his boots and his watch, and the quiet expression that people sometimes mistook for indifference, but was actually just concentration. Caleb was almost always concentrating on something. A sound, a pressure reading, a flickering light on the 8th floor that had been logged 3 times without anyone finding the actual cause. He found it. Loose ground wire behind the secondary junction box. Took him 11 minutes. The building was 42 floors of premium corporate real estate in the heart of the financial district, all glass and polished granite, and the kind of intentional lighting that made everyone inside look slightly more important than they probably were. The tenants were law firms and investment banks and one pharmaceutical company that occupied the entire 27th floor. The lobby alone cost more to maintain than most small office buildings cost to run entirely, and Caleb knew every inch of it, every tile, every recessed fixture, every elevator panel, every pressure sensor in the HVAC system. He moved through the building like water moves through a pipe, efficiently, without announcement. Taking the service stairs when the main elevators were busy, eating lunch in the sublevel break room at the same time every day, keeping his radio turned low so the static wouldn't bother the people he was working near. He was not invisible exactly, but close enough. Some of the executives had worked in the building for years and still didn't know his name. They knew him as the maintenance guy, or the technician, or sometimes just as him, as in, can someone call him to fix this? That didn't bother Caleb. He wasn't there to be known. He was there to work, and the work itself had a way of being satisfying that had nothing to do with recognition. There was one person in the building who did know his name. He'd never spoken to her directly. Not really. A nod in the corridor once, maybe 6 months ago, when they'd both reached the elevator bank at the same time and the car was taking too long. She'd glanced at him, not through him, which was rarer than it should have been, and he'd nodded, and she'd nodded back, and then the elevator had arrived and she'd stepped in first because that was just how these things worked. Victoria Sinclair, CEO and majority shareholder of Sinclair Capital Group, which occupied floors 35 through 42 and was responsible for the kind of financial decisions that made the business news 3 or 4 times a year. She was 30 years old. Caleb knew this because he'd read it somewhere. One of those magazine profiles that appeared on the break room table occasionally, left behind by the cleaning crew or someone from the mailroom. the youngest female CEO in the Fortune 500. There had been a photograph of her in a sharp charcoal blazer, arms crossed, expression composed in the specific way that people compose their expressions when they want to appear powerful without appearing cold, a balance that the article seemed to suggest she had spent considerable effort learning. In the photograph, she looked like someone who had everything exactly where she wanted it. In the building, in person, she looked like someone carrying something heavy that she would never put down. Caleb had noticed that too. He noticed things. It was the same part of his brain that heard the elevator groan and felt the vibration shift. The part that registered small signals before they became loud ones. Victoria Sinclair walked fast and stood straight and spoke in a voice that carried authority without effort, but her eyes, when she thought no one was watching, went somewhere else entirely. To a phone she checked too quickly. To a message that made her press her lips together for just a moment before her face rearranged itself back into composure. He didn't know what she was carrying. It wasn't his business to know. But he noticed. On the Thursday morning that would later divide his life into a clean before and after, Caleb started his shift at 6:45, which was 15 minutes earlier than his scheduled start time. He always arrived 15 minutes early. He'd been doing it so long it wasn't even a choice anymore. His body just woke up 15 minutes before it needed to and started moving. He checked the work orders first. 12 logged overnight. A tripped breaker on the 9th floor, a clogged drain in the 23rd floor bathroom, a HVAC complaint from the partners' conference room on 36, and 9 smaller items that would take somewhere between 5 and 20 minutes each. He prioritized mentally while he drank his coffee. Black, from the machine in the sub-level break room, which made mediocre coffee that he had stopped noticing years ago. His phone had 2 notifications from the previous night. One was a reminder about an appointment. The other was a message from a contact listed in his phone simply as Owen. He read the message twice. It said, "Finish the puzzle." The one with the lighthouses. Took me 4 days. Caleb typed back, "Which one did you start first? The border or the water?" He waited 30 seconds, sipping his coffee. Border. Always border first. You taught me that. Caleb looked at the message for a moment longer than necessary. Then he finished his coffee, clipped his badge to his pocket, picked up his toolbox, and went to work. Owen Dawson was 21 years old and lived 40 minutes away in a supported housing facility that he had chosen himself from a list of 3 options, which had taken him 11 days to decide because 11 days was how long he needed, and Caleb had understood that without being told and had not once suggested he hurry up. Owen was autistic. He had been diagnosed at 2 years and 8 months, which was earlier than most, and which Caleb now understood was partly luck, not in the diagnosis itself, but in what came after it. Early diagnosis meant early access to the kind of information that let a parent stop trying to fix what wasn't broken and start learning how to actually listen. Caleb had not been prepared. He wanted to be honest about that, at least with himself. When the developmental pediatrician had sat across from him in that small office with the children's drawings on the wall and used the word autism, Caleb had nodded in a way that he hoped looked like understanding, but was actually just shock wearing understanding's face. He'd driven home that afternoon in near silence while Owen slept in the car seat behind him, and he'd sat in the driveway for 12 minutes after pulling in because he didn't know what to do with the weight of it yet. He was 22 years old. He had no partner. His parents lived 3 states away and had their own lives and their own limitations. He had a son who was going to need things that Caleb didn't know how to give yet, and the gap between yet and never felt enormous in that driveway moment. But he'd gotten out of the car. He'd unbuckled Owen and carried him inside and put him in his crib, and then he'd sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and started reading. Not the terrifying stuff. He'd learned quickly to stay away from the forums where parents talked about their children in terms of loss and tragedy. He found the other places. The research. The first-person accounts written by autistic adults about what it felt like to be them, what helped, what made things worse, what they wished the people around them had understood sooner. He read for 6 hours that first night. He read for hundreds of hours over the months that followed. And then, more importantly, he watched Owen. Not watched him the way you watch something you're worried about, that constant anxious monitoring that communicates fear without words, and children absorb like weather. He watched him the way you watch something you're trying to understand. Curious, patient, willing to be wrong about what he thought he saw and look again. Owen at 3, lining up every car he owned by color, then by size, then by a system Caleb couldn't immediately identify until he realized it was by the sound they made when rolled across the hardwood floor. Owen at 4, covering his ears every time the smoke alarm went off, even when it was just the battery chirp, not the actual alarm. And Caleb learning to change the battery at a specific time of day when Owen was occupied with something absorbing, warning him first, letting him choose to be in a different room. Owen at 5, discovering that the pattern of light through the Venetian blinds at a certain time of afternoon was something he could watch for 30 minutes without moving, and Caleb learning not to interrupt that, not to redirect it, not to treat stillness as a problem that required solving. Owen at 7, 8, 9, learning that meltdowns were not tantrums, that they were not manipulation, that they were a system overloaded past its capacity to process, and that the only thing that helped was reduction. Less input, less demand, less noise, and presence without pressure. Just, I'm here. You're safe. Nothing is required of you right now. It took Caleb years to get good at that. He was not going to pretend otherwise. There were nights he got it wrong, nights he was too tired or too frustrated, and he said the wrong thing or made the wrong call, and Owen would retreat into himself in a way that made Caleb feel like he'd broken something he couldn't repair. There were appointments he missed because of work and school meetings that left him feeling inadequate, and one stretch of about 4 months when Owen was 9, where things were genuinely hard in a way that had no clean resolution, just had to be lived through. He lived through it. Owen lived through it. They figured it out together, imperfectly, the way most things that actually matter get figured out. Owen was 21 now and doing well, in the way that doing well meant something real and specific, not just the generic shorthand people used when they didn't know what else to say. He had a part-time job at a library, reshelving books, which suited him in ways that were not complicated to understand if you knew him at all. He had 2 friends he saw regularly, and a routine he'd built himself, and preferences about food and music, and the precise weight of blankets that he could now articulate with words, which hadn't always been true. He called Caleb every Sunday. Sometimes they talked for an hour, sometimes for 12 minutes. Owen always ended this call the same way. Not goodbye, just a quiet okay that meant the same thing, and Caleb had learned years ago to hear it right. The tripped breaker on the 9th floor turned out to be a vending machine drawing too much current from an outlet that wasn't rated for it. Caleb rerouted it to a dedicated circuit, made a note in the system, and was done in 40 minutes. The clogged drain on 23 was worse than the log described. It always was, and took an hour and 10 minutes and left him with a damp knee on his left pant leg that he dried off with a shop towel from his belt. He was on his way to the partners' conference room on 36 when the noise started. He heard it from inside the elevator, not the groan he'd been tracking all week, something else entirely. High-pitched, human, coming from below. He stopped at 34 instead, took the stairs down to the lobby level, and pushed through the service door into the main atrium just as the sound reached a pitch that made the woman behind the reception desk stand up from her chair. The lobby of Hargrove Tower was high-ceilinged and expensive-looking in a way that had been very carefully engineered to appear effortless. Marble floors and a pale gray that cost more per square foot than Caleb's monthly rent. A reception desk that curved in a wide arc of polished mahogany. Seating areas with low furniture and neutral tones, arranged around a central sculpture that Caleb privately thought looked like something that had fallen from a shelf but had been placed on a pedestal and given a 6-figure price tag. Right now, none of that mattered because there was a child in the center of the lobby floor, and he was in crisis. Caleb saw that immediately. He saw it before he could have explained how he saw it. The way the boy's body was positioned on his hands and knees on the marble, rocking in a motion that was not rhythmic but desperate. The way the sound coming out of him was not a standard cry, but something rawer and more fundamental. Not, I want something, not I'm hurt. Something closer to, I am overwhelmed past the point where words exist, and this is the only way my body knows how to release that. Caleb recognized it. He recognized it the way you recognize the face of someone you know, even in a crowd, even when you weren't expecting to see them. Around the boy, there were people. More people than made sense for the situation, or rather, more people than were helping the situation. Caleb counted 6 in the immediate circle, 2 in medical-looking attire, 1 woman with a lanyard around her neck speaking in a measured, practiced voice, 1 man crouching with what appeared to be a weighted blanket that the child was not accepting, 1 older man in a suit standing with his arms at his sides looking profoundly uncomfortable, and 1 woman who was not crouching, not approaching, not doing anything except standing 4 feet back with her arms wrapped around herself like she was the one who needed holding. Victoria Sinclair. She was not composed. That was the first thing Caleb noticed, not as an observation about her, but as information about the situation. He'd seen her in this building for 6 years in various states of controlled, measured, professional. He had never seen her face do what it was doing right now, which was something close to panic that she was failing to suppress through what looked like enormous effort. The child on the floor. Her child, he understood now, and something clicked into place about those phone checks, those pressed-together lips, was small for what looked like about 7. Dark hair, damp at the forehead, wearing a light blue shirt that had come untucked on one side. His hands were flat on the marble, and he kept pressing them down hard, then lifting them, pressing down again, like he was testing whether the ground was real. The woman with the lanyard was saying something about a calm-down corner. The man with the weighted blanket was attempting to inch it closer. One of the medical attire people was speaking into their phone. The other was holding a tablet displaying what appeared to be a communication board. The boy's screaming intensified every time any of them moved closer. "Is there a room we can—" someone started. "We've tried the room," said the man in the suit in a clipped voice that suggested this conversation had already happened. "If we can just get him to look at—" "He's not going to look at the board right now." This from Victoria, her voice cracked down the middle. "He's not going to look at anything right now." "Ms. Sinclair, if you'll just allow me to—" "I have allowed you." Her voice dropped to something quiet and precise and more frightening than shouting. "I have allowed all of you for 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Caleb looked at the boy. He looked at the space around the boy. The people. The noise they were creating even when they thought they were being quiet. The shifting movement. The unpredictability of multiple adults all operating independently without coordination, each one a separate input in an already overwhelmed system. He set his toolbox down against the wall. Quietly. He didn't announce himself. He didn't say "excuse me" or wait for someone to notice him or ask for permission to approach. He just walked forward at a pace that was slow enough to not add urgency to the air, stopped at the outer edge of the circle, and said, in a voice that was calm and direct and not performatively gentle, "I need everyone to take 3 steps back." There was a pause, the kind of pause that precedes either compliance or argument. "Who are—" the suited man started. 3 steps back, Caleb said again. Not louder, not softer. The same. All of you, including the woman talking, including the man with the blanket. 3 steps. Now. Something about the now, not aggressive, just certain, moved people. They stepped back, even the ones who clearly didn't want to. Victoria looked at him. He met her eyes for 1 second. He didn't smile. He didn't offer reassurance. He just held her gaze long enough to communicate, "I know what I'm looking at," and then he turned his attention back to her son. The boy's screaming had not stopped, but with the circle pulled back, the quality of the sound shifted. Still desperate, still at full volume, but slightly less frantic at the edges, the way a fire behaves slightly differently when you stop adding oxygen. Caleb didn't crouch immediately. He stood for a moment, watching. Not staring, watching. There's a difference. Staring is pressure. Watching is information gathering. The boy's hands were still pressing against the marble, lifting and pressing. His head was down. He was rocking. And every few seconds, with the index finger of his right hand, he was tracing something against the floor. Caleb watched the motion. He watched it twice, 3 times, tracking the shape. A curve. A point at the top. Lines radiating outward. He was drawing a sun. Over and over, the same shape, against the cold marble floor, like a request no one was reading. Caleb lowered himself to the floor. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just sat down cross-legged about 6 feet from the boy, which was far enough to not be intrusive and close enough to be present. He didn't speak. He didn't reach out. He didn't try to make eye contact. He just sat. The seconds stretched. The lobby was quieter now. Not silent. The boy was still making sound, but the chaotic overlay of adult voices and movement had stilled, and into that stillness Caleb looked at the floor around the boy. There, about 2 feet to the boy's left, half hidden under the edge of one of the neutral-toned lobby chairs where it must have rolled during the initial commotion, was a small object. He almost missed it. It was the size of his fist, made of plastic or soft rubber, yellow-orange, with a rounded center and short spikes radiating outward. A toy sun. He reached for it slowly. No sudden movement. He picked it up and held it in his palm and looked at it for a moment. Then he placed it on the floor between himself and the boy. Not pushed toward him, not presented with outstretched hand, just placed within the boy's field of vision if he chose to look. And then, very quietly, Caleb said one word. Son. Not look at this or I found your toy, or is this what you want? Just the word itself, offered like a hand extended palm up. The rocking slowed, not stopped. Slowed. The boy's finger, still moving in its tracing motion, traced the shape one more time, and then his head came up. Not all the way, not meeting Caleb's eyes, but enough that Caleb could see his face. 7 years old, maybe. Eyes red from crying, cheeks flushed, expression still carrying the residue of crisis. He looked at the toy sun on the floor. He looked at it for 4 full seconds without moving, and then he reached out and picked it up. The screaming stopped. Not gradually, not in the slow descent of someone calming down after a storm. It stopped the way a power cut stops a machine, immediate, complete. The sudden silence almost louder than the noise had been. The boy held the toy in both hands and pressed it against his chest and closed his eyes. His shoulders, which had been locked up around his ears for the better part of an hour, dropped 2 inches. He was still sitting on the marble floor. He was still not speaking. But the crisis had broken, and what was left was a small child holding a yellow toy and breathing. Behind Caleb, nobody moved. He sat with the boy for another minute. Not moving, not talking, just being in the space with him the way you sit with someone who has just gone through something hard. Not trying to fix it, not rushing them toward okay, just present. He heard someone exhale behind him. He thought it might have been Victoria, but didn't turn to check. When he finally stood up, he did it slowly, the way you rise from the floor near something you don't want to startle. He turned around. The lobby was frozen. The 2 medical attire people, the woman with the lanyard, the man with the weighted blanket still in his hands, the suited man. 4 other people Caleb hadn't noticed before. Executives from upstairs by the look of them, who must have come down at some point during the 40 minutes. And Victoria Sinclair, 4 feet from where she'd been standing before, who was looking at Caleb with an expression he didn't have a name for immediately. Gratitude, yes, but also something raw underneath it. Something like relief that had been held so long it had gotten heavier than it was supposed to be. She was trying not to cry. He could see that effort. She was very nearly not succeeding. He picked up his toolbox from where he'd left it against the wall. He looked at his watch. He still had the partners' conference room HVAC complaint on his list. "Wait," Victoria said. Her voice was quiet. Not the voice she used in the lobby normally, not the voice that carried authority without effort, just a person's voice. He stopped. She walked toward him. Not the long strides he'd seen her use crossing the lobby on ordinary mornings. She walked like someone whose legs had been working very hard for a long time and had just been asked to keep working. She stopped in front of him. Up close, she was not what the magazine photograph suggested. Or she was technically, but the photograph had captured only the surface layer and left out everything underneath it. The photograph had not captured the dark underneath her eyes, which spoke to the kind of sleep that gets interrupted regularly and then doesn't fully return. It had not captured the way her hands were shaking slightly, the kind of shaking that happens after adrenaline with nowhere to go. "How?" she said, and then she stopped and started again. "How did you do that?" It was not exactly a question the way questions normally are. It was closer to something she was asking the air in general, and he happened to be standing in the way of. Caleb looked past her at the boy, who was still sitting on the floor, holding the sun toy, rocking now in a much slower and gentler rhythm. One of the specialists was hovering uncertainly about 8 feet away. Caleb met the specialist's eyes and gave a small head shake. Not yet. Give him a minute. And the specialist, to their credit, took another small step back. He looked back at Victoria. He was drawing something, Caleb said. On the floor, the same shape over and over. She blinked. I didn't see that. You were watching his face, Caleb said, not as a criticism, just as a statement of what had happened. Everyone was watching his face. She processed that. He could see her processing it, not defensively, but genuinely, the way someone processes information they wish they'd had sooner. The toy had fallen, Caleb said, probably at the start of it. He was looking for it, and he couldn't. He paused, chose his words with some care. When things get that loud inside, it's hard to look, it's hard to search. So he was doing the only thing he could do, which was draw the shape and hope someone understood what he was asking for. Victoria looked at her son. Her throat moved. Nobody understood, she said. Nobody was looking at the floor, Caleb said. She turned back to him. Her eyes were very direct, which surprised him. He'd expected something more deflective, the professional composure reassembling itself. But she was looking at him straight on, unguarded in a way he suspected she wasn't often unguarded in a professional setting or in any setting that involved other people watching. Who are you? She asked, and then immediately, like she heard how that sounded. I mean, I know you work here, I've seen you, but I don't know your name. Caleb, he said. Caleb. She repeated it like she was filing it somewhere. I have to. She glanced back at her son. I need to go to him, but I need you to know. You don't need to do anything, Caleb said. Go to your son. She looked at him for one more second. Something moved in her expression that he couldn't quite read and wasn't going to try. Then she turned and walked back toward the boy, and the way she moved now was different from the professional walk and different from the exhausted walk. It was just a mother moving toward her child, no audience in her thoughts at all. Caleb watched for a moment as she sat down on the marble floor beside the boy, in her expensive suit on the floor of her own corporate lobby, without any visible hesitation about any of that. And the boy leaned slightly toward her without looking up, just a small gravitational shift, the kind of movement that happens between two people who have been through enough together that their bodies know the language even when words don't exist. He picked up his toolbox. He had a conference room HVAC complaint on the 36th floor. He had 8 more items on his work order list. The day was not half over. He took the service stairs. The HVAC complaint on the 36th floor turned out to be a calibration issue with the thermostat sensor, which was reading the room temperature 2 degrees lower than actual and compensating by running the system harder than it needed to. Caleb adjusted the sensor offset, ran a 15-minute test cycle, confirmed the correction, and logged it in the system. The whole job took 47 minutes. He did it quietly, in the corner of the conference room while 3 people had a meeting at the far end of the table and pretended he wasn't there, which was fine. He was used to being the person in the room that other people decided not to see. On his way back down, he stopped on the 23rd floor to check that the drain he'd cleared in the morning was holding. It was. He made a note about the pipe fitting that was going to need replacing within the next few months. Not urgent, but the kind of thing that became urgent if you waited too long. He wrote it up properly and submitted it through the work order system rather than just making a mental note, because mental notes had a way of getting lost when you were carrying too many things at once, and Caleb had learned a long time ago to put things where he could find them later. He ate lunch at 12:15 in the sub-level break room. A sandwich he'd made that morning, turkey, Swiss, mustard, no lettuce because he'd run out, and a coffee from the machine that he didn't taste. He sat alone at the table near the back wall and looked at his phone while he ate. Not at anything in particular, just the habit of having something to look at. He kept thinking about the lobby. Not in an anxious way. Not replaying it for anything he could have done differently. More the way you keep returning to a piece of music that did something unexpected to you. Not analyzing it, just aware that it's still running somewhere underneath everything else. The boy's face when he'd looked up, the way he'd reached for the sun toy with both hands and pressed it against his chest like something being reclaimed. The lobby full of expensive expertise going quiet all at once. Caleb finished his sandwich and threw away the wrapper and went back to work. The afternoon was a standard run of medium-sized problems. A water pressure complaint from the law firm on 11 that turned out to be a partially closed shutoff valve. Someone had bumped it, probably during the cleaning crew's overnight visit, and nobody had noticed because pressure loss is the kind of thing that sneaks up on you. A broken ceiling tile on the 4th floor, cracked at the corner where water had gotten in through a failing seal above it. Caleb replaced the tile and patched the seal and added a follow-up note to check the exterior caulking on that section during the next scheduled exterior inspection. A stuck fire door on 28 that needed the hydraulic closer adjusted. He was on the stairwell, landing on 28, crouched down with the closer in pieces around him, when his radio crackled. Dawson. It was Marcus, the building manager, who communicated primarily through the radio and only called Caleb by his last name, which was either professional habit or low-grade irritation. Caleb had never been sure which. "Yeah," Caleb said. "Need you to come up to 37 when you're done with whatever you're on. Fire door on 28, 20 minutes. A pause. "Make it 15. Caleb looked at the closer components on the landing floor. 20, he said. Another pause, slightly longer. "Fine." He put the closer back together in 18 minutes, tested the door 4 times, confirmed it was cycling correctly, and took the elevator to 37 because the stairwell opened on the wrong side of that floor, and the walk-around added 6 minutes he apparently didn't have. Floor 37 was the lower boundary of the Sinclair Capital Group's floors, used mostly for administrative offices, and what appeared to be a large conference and meeting space that took up the southern half of the floor. Caleb had been up here a handful of times for maintenance calls. A projector system that needed recalibrating, a kitchen appliance in the executive break room, an electrical issue in the server room that had turned out to be more straightforward than the IT team had feared. Marcus was waiting near the elevator bank. He was a compact man in his late 50s with a gray mustache and the particular posture of someone who had spent decades navigating between the people who owned buildings and the people who maintained them, slightly forward-leaning, permanently ready to absorb criticism from both directions simultaneously. "What's on 37?" Caleb asked. Marcus looked at him for a moment in a way that suggested the answer was not a broken ceiling tile. "Miss Sinclair's assistant called down an hour ago. She'd like to speak with you." Caleb absorbed this. "About what?" "She didn't say." "The assistant didn't say." Marcus paused. "This is about this morning, in the lobby." "I figured." "Do you want to tell me what happened in the lobby?" "I'll tell you whatever's in the incident report," Caleb said, "which I filed at 1:43. You should have it." "I read it." "It's very—" Marcus searched for the word. "Sparse. There wasn't much to report. Distressed child in the lobby. Situation resolved. No property damage. No injuries." "Caleb." Marcus's voice dropped slightly. "People are talking about it. I've had 3 calls this afternoon from tenants who were in the lobby or heard about it. Apparently you told a circle of doctors and specialists to step back and they did it. I asked them to give the kids some space. That's not quite how it's being described." Caleb looked at the elevator panel. "What would you like me to do, Marcus?" Marcus exhaled. "Just go talk to her. Whatever she wants, be professional, and if she offers you anything, money, a commendation, whatever, you check with me first before you agree to anything, because you're an employee of this building and there are—" "Understood," Caleb said. He wasn't really listening to the rest of it. He was already thinking about what he was going to say, which turned out to be not much because he believed in entering situations without a prepared script when possible. Scripts made you miss what was actually happening in front of you. The administrative assistant, young, dark-haired, visibly still processing what sounded like a very unusual afternoon, led him to a corner office at the south end of the floor. Glass walls looking out over the city on 2 sides. A desk that was actually clear, which surprised him. He'd expected the organized chaos of someone running a large enterprise, but the desk had only a laptop, a phone, and a framed photograph turned away from him. Victoria Sinclair was standing at the window when he came in. Not seated, waiting, standing, looking out over the city with her arms crossed the same way they'd been crossed in that magazine photograph, except the energy was entirely different now. The photograph had been controlled. This was a person who needed somewhere to put her arms. She turned when she heard him come in. She'd changed clothes since the morning. Different jacket, same kind of composed professional exterior, but the underneath of her face was the same as the lobby. The effort was still visible. "Caleb," she said, "thank you for coming up." "Sure," he said. She gestured toward a chair in front of the desk. He sat. She stayed standing for another moment, like she was deciding something, and then sat in the chair beside her desk rather than behind it, which he noticed. "Leo is upstairs," she said. "My assistant's floor has We set up a room up there for days when I bring him in. He's calm now. Sleeping, actually." Something shifted in her expression. "He hasn't slept in the middle of the day in about 2 years." Caleb nodded. "He had the toy with him when he fell asleep," she said. "The sun. He wouldn't put it down." "Kids don't usually put down the thing that helped," Caleb said. "Not right away. Give him time. He'll start to feel safe enough to set it somewhere and know it'll still be there." Victoria looked at him with an expression he was getting slightly better at reading. Not suspicious exactly, more like recalibrating, like someone adjusting the lens on a camera and realizing the image is different from what they expected. "Can I ask where Leo was before the lobby?" Caleb said. "Before everything started." She blinked. Clearly not the question she was expecting. "He was with me in a meeting. There have been some scheduling issues with his usual care provider this week, and I didn't want him to miss 2 days in a row, so I brought him in. He's been here before. It's usually..." She paused. "It's usually manageable." "What was the meeting about?" Another blink. "Quarterly projections. Why?" Caleb thought about how to say the next part. "How long was it?" 2 hours, maybe 2.5. "Fluorescent lighting in the conference room?" Victoria stared at him. Yes, standard lighting. People coming in and out? It was a full team meeting, so, yes, several people." "Loud?" We had a disagreement about some numbers. It got somewhat heated." She stopped. He watched her face as she worked through what he was building toward, putting the pieces in order. "He started getting agitated in the last 40 minutes of the meeting," she said slowly. "I should have taken him out. I knew I should have taken him out, but I needed to be there for the discussion, and I thought..." She stopped again. "I thought he could hold on." "He held on for a long time," Caleb said. 2.5 hours is a lot. For a kid who processes things the way Leo does, that room was probably running at full volume the whole time. The light, the sound, the unpredictability of a heated discussion. By the time you got to the lobby, he was already way past his limit. The lobby just happened to be where it finally broke through. Victoria was quiet for a moment. The specialist said it was a behavioral issue, that he was seeking attention. Caleb kept his face neutral. "What do you think?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I think he was asking for his toy, and nobody understood what he was asking." "Yeah," Caleb said. "That's what I think too." She stood up, which he recognized as the movement of someone who can't hold still when they're thinking, and walked to the window again. The city spread out below them, mid-afternoon light hitting the other towers at a low angle that turned the glass facades into something almost warm-looking. "I have 3 behavioral specialists on his team," she said to the window. "One of them charges $400 an hour. I have a pediatric neurologist, a speech therapist, an occupational therapist. We do ABA 3 times a week. I've read every book that's been published in the last 5 years. I have a dedicated care coordinator who manages his schedule." She turned. "And a maintenance technician figured out what was wrong in 30 seconds. "I had an advantage they didn't," Caleb said. "What advantage?" "I've seen it before." She waited. He understood that she was waiting for more, and he decided to give it to her because she'd been honest with him about the meeting and the 2.5 hours, and the moment she knew she should have taken him out, but didn't, and honesty generally deserved to be met with honesty. "My son is autistic," Caleb said. "He's 21 now. But I spent years learning how he communicates, which is not always the way most people expect communication to look. When a kid is overwhelmed past the point of words, they don't stop communicating." They just stop using the channels other people are watching. Leo was using the only channel he had left, drawing on the floor. And everyone in that lobby was watching his face and his sound level and trying to evaluate and treat something they'd categorized as a behavioral incident. Nobody was watching his hands. Victoria sat back down, slowly, like the weight of what he'd said required sitting. "Owen," she said. "Your son." Caleb nodded. "Is he... You said he's 21. Is he... He's doing well," Caleb said. "He has a job, a place he lives. He called me Sunday. We talked about a puzzle he finished." He paused. "He's not a success story in the inspirational poster sense. He's just a person who figured out how to build a life that works for him. That took a long time. Neither of us is the same as we were." Victoria was watching him with that recalibrating expression again. "How old were you when he was diagnosed?" 22. "Were you... Was his mother?" "No," Caleb said. "It was just me." She took that in. The afternoon light coming through the windows shifted slightly as a cloud moved, and for a moment the office was dim and then bright again. "I was 23 when Leo was diagnosed," she said. "He was 18 months. I was in the middle of closing my Series B funding round." She said it without apparent expectation that he'd know what that meant or be impressed by it, just as context, the way you place facts in order when you're trying to be accurate about something. His father had been out of the picture for almost a year at that point. So it was... Yes, just me. Caleb nodded. He didn't fill the space with words. She had more. "Everyone told me I could handle it, that I had the resources." Her voice was carefully level. "And I did have the resources. I hired the best people I could find. I read everything. I made sure Leo had whatever he needed." She looked at her hands. "But no one told me that having all the resources doesn't necessarily mean you understand your own child." "No," Caleb said. "It doesn't. I thought knowledge could substitute for..." She stopped, tried again. "I thought if I built the right team, the right structure, that it would translate into connection, understanding. But that's not how it works, is it?" "It's not how it works," Caleb said. "The team and the structure help. They're not nothing, but they're not the thing itself." She looked at him. "What's the thing itself?" He thought about Owen at 3, lining up cars by the sound they made on the hardwood floor. Owen at 5, watching light through the Venetian blinds. Owen at 9, during the 4 months that were just hard, no clean resolution, just lived through. "Time," Caleb said, "and being willing to be wrong about what you think you see, and looking at the floor instead of the face." She was quiet for long enough that he wondered if he'd said too much, or said it the wrong way, or if she was simply processing and needed the silence. He waited. He had gotten reasonably good at waiting. "I want to give you the money," she said finally. He looked at her. "In the lobby. When it first started, when Leo first went down and I couldn't..." She pressed her lips together briefly. "I made an offer. In front of everyone. $750,000 to whoever could help him." She met his eyes. "That's yours." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I don't want the money," he said. She looked at him with an expression that suggested this was not a response she encountered often. "Caleb, I didn't do anything for the money," he said. Not harshly. "I did it because I knew what I was looking at and I had something that could help. That's not a transaction." "It doesn't have to be about what you intended," she said. "You did something that..." She paused. "I watched my son calm down in 60 seconds after 40 minutes of crisis. Do you understand what that was like to watch?" "I have some idea," Caleb said. She looked at him. And there it was again, that expression he'd seen at the edge of it in the lobby, the gratitude that had been held long enough to get heavier than it was meant to be. She was not a person who leaned on people easily. He could see the architecture of that in everything about how she held herself, how she'd arranged her life, how she'd built an entire support structure for her son out of hired expertise and personal research rather than asking anyone for anything that felt like need. She was leaning now, slightly. He thought she probably didn't realize it. "There are strings attached to the money if I take it," Caleb said. Maybe not legal strings, but the kind that change what this conversation was. She considered that. What if there were no strings? There are always strings. Not because of anything you'd intend, just because of what that amount of money does to the air between two people. He looked at her directly. The conversation we just had, about Leo, about Owen, about watching the floor instead of the face, we had that conversation because I'm a maintenance technician and you're, he gestured slightly. This, because there was no transaction between us. The money changes that. Victoria looked at the window, then back at him. You're telling me to keep $750,000. I'm telling you to spend it on something that matters. Like what? He hadn't planned to say the next part. It came the way some things came, not from planning, but from the same place that had heard the elevator groan before anyone else and known immediately what it meant. The same place that had seen a child drawing on a marble floor and understood what he was asking. There are families in this city, Caleb said, who are where I was when Owen was 4, who don't have the team and the specialists and the reading and the resources, who have a kid they love and don't understand and they're scared, and the only information they're getting is about what's wrong with their child instead of how to actually hear them. He paused. You could build something for those families, not a clinic, not another program run by specialists who charge $400 an hour, something where parents learn how to look at the floor. The room was very quiet. Victoria was looking at him with an expression that had moved past recalibrating into something else he didn't have an immediate name for. Not admiration exactly. He'd have been uncomfortable with admiration, more like recognition. The specific expression of someone who has just heard an idea that matched a shape already in their mind they didn't know was there. You've thought about this, she said. Not about you doing it, he said honestly. Just in general, for a long time. She stood and walked to the window again. He let her think. Outside, the city continued its afternoon activity. Cars moving in the street 20 stories below, a construction crane on the next block pivoting slowly, a pigeon landing on the window ledge and then changing its mind and leaving. The ordinary machinery of a city that didn't know or care about what was happening in this office. I would need to understand it properly, she said to the window. I don't do things without understanding them first. That's probably a good quality in someone building something like this, Caleb said. She turned. There was something different in her face now. Still the professional composure as the base layer, but something under it that was more uncertain and because of that more real. I'd need someone who knows what they're talking about, not a specialist from a brochure, someone who's actually been in it. Caleb looked at her. That's not an offer I'm in a position to take on, he said carefully. I have a job. I know, she said. I'm not making an offer. I'm just thinking out loud. Okay, he said. They looked at each other across the office for a moment. It was not a comfortable silence exactly. It was the silence of two people who have said more honest things to each other in 40 minutes than most conversations contain, and who are both aware of that and uncertain what to do with the awareness. Can I ask you something? Victoria said. Sure. The specialists in the lobby, the team I've built for Leo. She chose her next words with care. Do you think they're wrong? What they're doing? Caleb thought about this genuinely rather than giving her the answer that would be easiest to hear. No, he said. I think a lot of what they're doing is probably right or right enough. A BA has problems, but it's not nothing. Occupational therapy is genuinely useful. The speech work, he paused. Leo is 7 and he's using communication that a lot of people aren't reading. That suggests there's real ability there. The specialist probably sees some version of that. But, she said, there's a difference between a team that understands autism in general and a parent who understands their specific child. The team can't do the second part. That one is yours. Her jaw moved slightly, not quite a reaction she'd let become visible, but close. And if I'm not doing it well? You brought him to a 2.5-hour meeting in a fluorescent-lit conference room and knew halfway through you should have taken him out and didn't, Caleb said. That's not a failure of love. That's just being human and having a career and a life that has demands and a kid who has needs, and those things colliding in a lobby on a Thursday afternoon. He let that land for a second. The question isn't whether you're doing it well, it's whether you're willing to keep learning. Victoria was quiet for a long time after that. When she finally spoke, her voice was slightly different. Not broken exactly. More like something that had been held very tightly for a long time had been set down and allowed to take its actual shape. He was drawing suns, she said. I didn't know that was his thing. The sun toy. It was a gift from someone, I don't even remember who, and he latched onto it. I knew he carried it everywhere. I didn't know he drew them. She stopped. I didn't know what it meant. Now you do, Caleb said. Yes, she said quietly. Now I do. He stood up. The afternoon was getting on, and he still had work order items he hadn't closed out, and Marcus would be watching the system and noting the open tickets, and the day had already been strange enough without adding incomplete paperwork to it. Thank you for coming up, Victoria said. Her professional voice was back, but only on the surface. Underneath it, everything he'd seen in the lobby was still there, still present. Sure, he said. He was at the door when she spoke again. Caleb. He turned. She was standing by her desk, one hand resting on the surface of it. Not posed, just resting, the way a person stands when they're tired and need something solid nearby. What you said, about building something, for the families who don't have the resources. Yeah, he said. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to think about it. He nodded. He believed her. He wasn't sure why exactly, except that she had the same quality Owen had when he said he was going to do something. Not the socialized performance of intention, the yes, of course, that meant nothing, but the particular stillness of someone who meant what they said and didn't bother to say things they didn't mean. Good, Caleb said. He walked out of the office, through the administrative floor to the elevator. He pressed the button for sublevel 2. He rode down alone, in the quiet of the elevator car, listening without planning to for the cable system. The groan was still there. The replacement part had been ordered but hadn't arrived yet. Tomorrow or Friday, he thought. He'd scheduled the repair for an early morning window before the building filled up. He stepped out of the elevator into the service corridor and went back to his workday. 3 floors above the lobby, where it had all happened, in a room that Victoria had set up for days when she had no other option, Leo Sinclair was sleeping on a small couch, with a yellow sun toy pressed against his chest and both hands curled around it, and his face in sleep was the face of any 7-year-old sleeping, unguarded, ordinary, entirely at peace. Nobody was watching him except a young administrative assistant who checked in every 20 minutes from the hallway and who had been told by her employer in a voice that was quieter and less certain than its usual register to make absolutely sure he still had the toy when he woke up. Down in sublevel 2, Caleb Dawson closed out his afternoon work orders one by one, methodically, in the order he'd completed them. He wrote his notes with the same care he always did. Specific, accurate, complete enough that someone else could pick up where he'd left off if needed. That was the thing about maintenance work that people didn't always understand. You were never really doing it for the present moment. You were doing it so that the future had something solid to stand on. He finished the last ticket at 5:47. He cleaned his tools the same way he did every day, in the same order. He put on his jacket. He walked to the parking structure 2 blocks east and found his truck on the 3rd level where he always parked it, and he sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. Not for any particular reason, just because it had been a long day, in a way that had nothing to do with the physical work. He thought about Owen drawing on the floor of their apartment. Not marble. Old linoleum, the apartment they'd had when Owen was 5. The one with the radiator that clicked all winter, and the window that stuck from November to March. Owen on the floor with his finger tracing the same shape over and over, and Caleb sitting nearby trying to understand what the shape was before he understood that understanding the shape mattered less than just staying close. He hadn't always done it right. He wanted to be honest about that. Not beating himself up honest, just accurate about history honest. There were times he'd been too tired and too frustrated, and he'd tried to redirect when he should have stayed still. Times he'd worried so hard about the future that he'd missed what was happening in the present. Times he'd looked at his son's face instead of his hands. He'd learned. Slowly, imperfectly, over years. He started the truck and pulled out of the parking structure and drove home through the late afternoon traffic, which was heavy and slow and completely indifferent to anything that had happened in the lobby of Hargrove Tower that Thursday morning. His phone rang through the truck's speakers at the second red light. The contact name on the display said simply, Owen. Caleb answered, Hey. Hey. Owen's voice was the same as always, slightly flat in register in a way that had nothing to do with affect, just how Owen's voice sounded, which Caleb had stopped hearing as unusual so long ago he couldn't remember when the shift happened. You sound tired. I am a little tired, Caleb said. How are you? I finished sorting the new graphic novel section at work. They let me redesign the display order. By what criteria? Color first, then by series. It looks better. The other librarian said it looks better. Does it? A pause. Yes. Objectively. Caleb smiled, which Owen couldn't see but didn't need to. I had an interesting day. What happened? Caleb thought about how to answer that. He drove through the intersection and merged left and thought about a boy on a marble floor drawing the shape of a sun over and over, asking to be understood in the only language he had left. I saw a kid today, Caleb said, about 7, in the lobby of my building. He was overwhelmed and nobody could figure out what he needed. A pause. Owen processing. But you figured it out. I looked at his hands instead of his face, Caleb said. He was drawing something. What was he drawing? Suns, Caleb said. Another pause, longer. When Owen spoke again, his voice had the particular quality it got when something had landed in a place that mattered. Did he calm down? Yeah, Caleb said. He did. Good, Owen said simply. They drove, or rather, Caleb drove, and Owen sat in his apartment 40 minutes away, and they were quiet together the way they'd learned to be quiet together, the silence carrying the same weight as the words. I'm going to make pasta tonight, Owen said eventually, the kind with the sun-dried tomatoes. That's a good kind, Caleb said. I know. The traffic opened up ahead of him, and Caleb drove home through the ordinary Thursday evening, and the day settled into whatever shape days settle into when they're over, not clean and not resolved, but complete in the way that days are complete, having happened and left something behind and moved on. The replacement part for the elevator cable system arrived Friday morning, which was earlier than Caleb had expected. He'd scheduled the repair for the following Tuesday during the 5 to 7 window before the building filled up. But when the part showed up at the loading dock at 7:15 Friday, he went down, signed for it, looked at his schedule for the day, and decided that Tuesday was now unnecessary. He could do it this morning if he started immediately and moved the 2 non-urgent items on his Friday list to Monday. He sent Marcus a message through the building system explaining the change in schedule and the reason for it. Marcus responded 12 minutes later with a single word, fine, which was Marcus's version of enthusiastic approval. Caleb spent the first 2 hours of his morning in the elevator shaft, which was not a comfortable place to spend 2 hours, but was the kind of work he didn't mind, physical, specific, with a clear before and clear after. The groaning cable component came out without drama, and the replacement went in without drama, and he ran the car through 15 cycles to confirm the repair had held before he climbed out of the shaft and closed the access panel, and wrote up the completion report with the same level of detail he always used. The groan was gone. The elevator moved the way elevators were supposed to move, which is to say without any particular personality at all. He was back on the main floor by 9:40, hands clean, coffee from the sublevel machine, working through the rest of his morning list. The building moved around him in its usual patterns. The mid-morning flow of people between floors, the delivery trucks at the loading dock, the low background hum of HVAC and electrical systems doing their jobs without complaint. Nothing from 37. Nothing from Victoria Sinclair's office. He hadn't expected anything, but he noticed the absence the way you notice the absence of a sound you'd been hearing. He thought about what she'd said. I'm going to think about it. And then deliberately stopped thinking about it, because it was her decision to make, and her money, and her life. And he had work to do. By Friday afternoon, the lobby incident had become a specific kind of building gossip, the sort that travels fast in the first 24 hours and then calcifies into a fixed story that people repeat slightly differently each time. Caleb knew this because Carlos from the front desk, who was 24 and enthusiastic about most things and genuinely good at his job, stopped him near the mailroom at 2:15 with the expression of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity. "Dude," Carlos said, "I have to ask." "Ask," Caleb said, because there was no productive alternative. "Yesterday, in the lobby." Carlos lowered his voice by approximately 10%, which still left it at a volume most people would consider normal. "I wasn't there. I was on my break. And I have been hearing about it from everyone all day. Lucinda from 22 said you walked into a circle of like 6 doctors and told them all to back up. I asked them to give the kids some space. And they did it. Eventually." Carlos stared at him with the expression of someone who found this deeply unsatisfying as an account of events. "That's it? That's the whole story?" "The kid had lost a toy. Once he had it back, he calmed down. But you were the only one who figured that out." Caleb sipped his coffee. "I was looking at the right place." Carlos opened his mouth, closed it, appeared to decide something. "Okay, but Lucinda also said Miss Sinclair offered like almost $1 million to whoever helped him." Caleb said nothing. "And that you didn't take it." "Lucinda talks a lot," Caleb said. "She does," Carlos agreed readily. "Did you not take the money?" Caleb looked at him. Carlos was a good kid, genuinely good, not just young. He did his job well, and he remembered people's names, and he'd covered for Caleb once when Caleb was 20 minutes late due to a school thing with Owen years ago that Carlos had no reason to know about but had asked no questions. Caleb felt some version of mild obligation to be honest with him. "It wasn't mine to take," Caleb said. Carlos thought about this for a moment. "Because you were on the clock?" "Because it would have changed what the moment was," Caleb said. "Some things aren't transactions." Carlos looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, with the particular nod of someone who doesn't fully understand but has decided to accept the statement as probably true. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, okay." He paused. "For what it's worth, you're like the person everyone in this building is talking about right now." "That'll stop," Caleb said. "Probably," Carlos agreed. "But still." Caleb finished his coffee and went back to work. He was wrong about one thing, though. It didn't entirely stop. The following Wednesday, 8 days after the lobby incident, he got a message through the building's internal system, not from Marcus, from the 37th floor administrative office, routed through the tenant request system, which meant it had been filed as an official building communication rather than a personal one. The message was brief and used the particular neutral language of formal correspondence. "Mr. Dawson, Miss Sinclair would like to schedule a meeting at your earliest convenience. Please advise your available times this week or next. D. Park, Executive Assistant to Victoria Sinclair." Caleb read it twice. Then he replied with 3 available times, the first being the following morning at 7:30 before his regular shift started, which he included because he genuinely wasn't sure what was appropriate here, and offering time outside his work hours seemed like the right gesture for a meeting that wasn't technically building business. D. Park replied within the hour. "Tomorrow at 7:30 works. Thank you." He didn't tell Marcus. He thought about it and decided against it, partly because Marcus would ask questions he couldn't answer yet, and partly because, whatever this was, it was still early enough that describing it to someone else would give it a weight and shape it might not actually have. He told Owen on Sunday instead during their regular call, because telling Owen things was different from telling other people things. Owen absorbed information without layering reaction onto it immediately, which meant that talking to him was one of the few places Caleb could say something out loud without simultaneously managing how it landed. "She wants to meet again," Owen said. "Yeah." "About the thing you told her, the Center for Families." "I assume she didn't say specifically." Owen was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to help her build it?" "I don't know what she's asking yet." "But if she asks," Owen said. Not pushing, just precise. Owen was always precise when he was interested in something. Caleb thought about it genuinely. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know if I'm the right person for something like that." "You knew what to do in the lobby," Owen said. "That's different." "How?" Caleb didn't answer immediately, and Owen, to his credit, waited. That was the thing about conversations with Owen. He asked questions and then actually waited for the answer, which was rarer than it had any right to be. What I did in the lobby was just recognition, Caleb said finally. I saw something I knew, building something organized, a center, a program. That's a different kind of knowledge. I don't know if I have it. You don't have to have it all, Owen said. You just have to have the part that matters. Caleb let that sit for a moment. When did you get wise? I've always been wise, Owen said flatly. You just weren't always listening. Despite everything, Caleb laughed. It was a real laugh, short and sudden. Fair enough, he said. He drove to Hargrove Tower the next morning 30 minutes earlier than usual, which was saying something. The building was quiet in a way it only was before 7. The lobby lights on their morning dimmer setting, Carlos not yet at the desk, a single security guard at the entrance who nodded at Caleb without speaking because they'd been passing each other in this lobby for 6 years and had arrived at the comfortable wordlessness of people who don't need preamble. Dee Park met him at the elevator on 37 at exactly 7:30. She was younger than he'd imagined from the correspondence, mid-20s, brisk in the way of someone who'd organized her life around precision because precision was the only way to keep up with Victoria Sinclair's pace. She walked him to the corner office without small talk, which he appreciated. Victoria was already there. She was seated behind the desk this time, which was different from last week when she'd sat beside it. The desk still had the laptop and the phone and the framed photograph turned away from him. She had a coffee cup in front of her and a legal pad covered in handwriting that she turned face down when he came in, not secretively but with the instinct of someone who didn't like showing their working notes until they were ready. "Caleb," she said, "thank you for coming in early." "Sure," he said. He sat down across from her. She looked like she'd slept more than she had 8 days ago. Not well, exactly. There was still the particular quality around her eyes that spoke to nights interrupted regularly. But more than before. She had the look of someone who'd been thinking hard about something for a week and had arrived at a conclusion she was now prepared to defend. "I've been doing research," she said. He waited. "Into family support programs for autism. What exists, what works, what's missing. I had my team compile information and then I spent the last week going through it myself rather than having someone summarize it for me." She paused. "What's missing is substantial." "Yeah," he said. "The programs that exist are largely clinical, therapy-focused. They address the child's development, which matters, but there's almost nothing designed specifically for parents, particularly parents without significant resources, that teaches them how to understand their child's individual communication, not autism communication in general, their child specifically." She looked at him. "Which is what you described." "That's what I described," he said. She opened the legal pad. He caught a glimpse of it before she oriented it toward him. Dense handwriting, diagrams, what appeared to be a budget sketch in the margin. "I want to build it," she said. "A foundation and learning center. Not a clinic. Not another ABA satellite program. Something designed from the ground up around the idea of teaching parents to understand their specific child." She paused. "I've spent the last week trying to figure out what that actually looks like in practice. And I keep arriving at the same gap." "What gap?" "The clinical expertise I can hire. The facilities I can fund. The programming structure I can design with the right consultants." She looked at him steadily. "What I can't find by hiring someone is the knowledge that comes from having actually done it. From being the parent in the room who figured it out the slow way." She set the legal pad down. "That's not something a credential gives you." Caleb looked at her. The morning light was coming through the windows at a low angle, the city just starting to wake up outside, and the office had the particular quality of early morning spaces, quieter and more honest than they'd be in 2 hours when the day's wait settled in. "What are you asking me?" he said. Because she hadn't asked yet, not directly, and he wanted the direct version. "I'm asking you to consult on the curriculum," she said. "Not run the center, not manage programs. Consult on what the parent education component actually needs to contain based on your experience. What you learned that the books didn't teach you, what helped, and what didn't. What you'd have wanted someone to tell you when Owen was 4. She paused. We would compensate you properly for that time. I want to be clear about the compensation because I know you declined the money last week and I'm not trying to reintroduce that through a side door. This is a different thing. Caleb looked at the legal pad. At the handwriting he couldn't read from this angle but could see was thorough. At the budget sketch in the margin that suggested she'd already run numbers. You've been working on this for 8 days, he said. Yes. You turned a lobby conversation into a business plan in 8 days. Preliminary framework, she corrected, with a small precision that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. Not a plan. Plans have execution timelines. This is still a framework. He almost smiled back. What's the timeline on the framework becoming a plan? Depends on whether I have the right people involved. She looked at him directly. You told me the team can't do the second part, the part that's about understanding a specific child. But the team also can't tell me whether the program I'm designing would actually have helped a parent like you when you needed it. I need someone who knows what that looked like from inside. Caleb sat with that for a moment. The chair was good, expensive, the kind that didn't make you aware of being in it. He noticed this and found it faintly ironic. I have a job, he said. I know. This building doesn't fix itself. I know that too. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not asking you to leave your job. The consulting would be outside your regular hours. Evenings, weekends, whatever works for your schedule. And if at any point it becomes a conflict, we stop. Simple as that. He looked at her. She was doing the thing she'd done in the lobby, looking at him straight on, no deflection. He'd decided by now that this was not a technique she used. It was just how she operated, at least in the moments when she'd set the professional surface down and was operating from underneath it. Can I ask you something first? He said. Yes. Leo, in the last week and a half, how has he been? She blinked, not expecting the pivot, or expecting it, but not expecting it first. Better, she said. Then, with the precision she seemed unable to turn off entirely. Different. I changed some things. She looked at the window briefly. I've been watching his hands. Caleb nodded. And he draws suns. You were right. Everywhere. On his napkins, on the condensation on windows, on the back of his hand when he's bored. I never noticed. She paused. He drew one on my arm 2 days ago, with his finger, while we were sitting together before bed, and I said sun, and he looked at me. Really looked at me, not the brief sideways glance I usually get. And then he did it again, on my arm, and I said it again. Her voice was careful and controlled and doing most of the work of keeping what was underneath it contained. We did that for about 10 minutes. Yeah, Caleb said quietly. It's not a full communication system, she said. I know that. I don't have illusions about how slow this is or how much work there is. She stopped. But it was 10 minutes where I knew exactly what he was saying, and he knew I understood. That hadn't happened before. Not really. Caleb looked at her and thought about Owen at 5, watching light through Venetian blinds. Himself sitting beside him, not redirecting, just present. The way the afternoon light moved across the floor, and Owen tracked it without words, and Caleb watched and understood without words, and between them something passed that didn't need language because it was simpler and more important than language. Okay, he said. Victoria looked at him. I'll consult, he said. On the curriculum, the parent education piece. We'd need to talk through what I actually know versus what I think I know, because those aren't always the same thing, and I don't want to build something on the second category. That's exactly the kind of thinking I need, she said, and the precision in her voice had something genuine in it that was different from the professional version. And I'm going to tell you when something feels wrong, he said. If you go in a direction that I think is more about the optics of helping than about actually helping, I'm going to say so. I expect that, she said. That's not a caveat I have a problem with. Good. He looked at the legal pad. Can I see what you have so far? She turned it toward him. He leaned forward and read. She'd been thorough in a way that suggested genuine engagement rather than delegation. The notes covered everything from facility design considerations, sensory-friendly spaces, lighting options, acoustic management, to programming structure, staffing models, family intake processes. She'd written questions in the margins where she'd hit walls she knew she couldn't solve from research alone. The budget sketch was realistic in the sense that it was large but not reckless. The kind of number that suggested she'd actually thought about what things cost rather than just writing a check and assuming that covered it. There were things in it that were right. There were things that were well-intentioned but off in ways that would only be obvious if you'd been in the room when a family arrived with a newly diagnosed child and a printout from the internet and a fear so specific and nameless that no program checklist could have accounted for it. This part, Caleb said, pointing to the section on initial family assessment. The intake structure you've outlined, it's designed around the child's profile. Diagnosis, behavior history, current therapies, that's all useful. But the first conversation with a family shouldn't be about the child's profile. Victoria looked. What should it be about? The parent, Caleb said. What they understand, what they're afraid of, what they've already tried, what they've been told is wrong with their kid, and how they've absorbed that. He looked up. Because you can't teach someone to look at the floor if they're still operating from the belief that what's on the floor is a problem that needs correcting. You have to understand where they're starting. Victoria picked up her pen and made a note. Not a polite acknowledging note. She actually wrote, fast and specific, the way someone writes when the thought is real. What else? She said. They worked for 90 minutes. Not the polished back and forth of a formal consulting engagement, but more like two people arguing their way toward something better than what either of them started with. Caleb pointing to gaps and Victoria pushing back on some of them, not out of defensiveness, but out of genuine belief in her own reasoning, which turned out to be correct about half the time, and needed adjustment the other half. And she adjusted without drama when she saw the case for it. She was not easy to work with. He noticed this and found it more reassuring than not, because the things that would be built by someone who was easy to work with were generally not as good as the things built by someone who was difficult in the specific way that Victoria Sinclair was difficult, demanding of quality, intolerant of vagueness, inclined to ask why until the why was actually answered. At 9:15, he looked at his watch and said he needed to start his regular shift. Of course, she said immediately, no argument. He stood and picked up his jacket. Send me what you have when you've incorporated the notes. I'll look at it and come back with questions. How do you want to communicate? Email? He thought about it. Email works. I'm not on my phone much during the day. That's fine. She paused. One more thing. She reached into the desk drawer and set something on the desk between them. A business card, plain white, her name, and a number. That's my direct line. Not through the assistant. If anything comes up, in the building, with this, whatever, you can use it. He looked at the card. He picked it up. Thanks. Caleb. He was almost at the door again. He turned. She was standing now, which seemed to be her default posture for endings. What you told me last week. That the question isn't whether I'm doing it well, but whether I'm willing to keep learning. She held his gaze. I've been thinking about that all week. Good thoughts or bad thoughts? Uncomfortable thoughts, she said. Which I've decided means they're probably the right ones. He nodded. He left. He took the elevator down to sub-level 2, changed into his work clothes, clipped his badge to his pocket, and started his Thursday the same way he'd started every Thursday for 6 years, with the work order list and the coffee and the quiet efficiency that moved through the building like water through a pipe. But something had shifted in the background of the day, not dramatically. Not in any way that would be visible to Carlos or Marcus or anyone else in the building, just a small recalibration of something he'd stopped expecting to recalibrate. He was on the 3rd floor replacing a light fixture at 11 when his phone buzzed. An email from a domain that said sinclairgroupcorporate.com. Subject line Draft V2. Framework notes. She'd incorporated everything they'd discussed and added 3 new questions in the margins where the conversation had opened new gaps she wanted to think through. He read it standing on the ladder, which was not ideal, and replied briefly that he'd look more carefully tonight and get back to her by Friday. She replied in 4 minutes. Take your time. Do it right. He put his phone in his pocket and went back to the light fixture. The weeks that followed developed their own rhythm. Not the rhythm he'd have predicted. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't transformative in any sudden way. It was more like a second track running underneath his regular life, present but not overwhelming. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, usually. 2 hours, sometimes 3. He'd read her draft materials and marked them up, and they'd talk through the markings, either in her office before his shift started or by phone in the evening when Leo was in bed and she had time. She was a fast learner in the way of people who'd spent their whole lives having to learn fast, and she had a particular quality that he hadn't expected. She was willing to be wrong out loud. Not easily, not without some resistance, but once she saw the case clearly, she'd set her previous position down and move forward from the new one without the kind of defensive backtracking that made working with some people exhausting. He met Leo 3 weeks in, which happened not by design but by the same kind of circumstance that had happened before. Victoria brought him to the building on a day when the usual care arrangement fell through, and Caleb was doing a maintenance check on the air handling unit in the floor's small kitchen when Leo came in with the administrative assistant and immediately stopped moving the way children stop when they encounter something unexpected. Caleb was on the floor with the access panel open, which probably looked strange. He stayed where he was and didn't turn around immediately, just continued what he was doing, giving the boy time to process the scene without any pressure to react to it. After about 30 seconds, he heard small footsteps approach. He glanced sideways without turning his head fully. Leo was about 4 feet away, looking at the open panel with an expression of genuine interest. Not the hesitant social interest of a child trying to figure out what an adult wants from them, but the focused investigative interest of someone who had seen something mechanical they wanted to understand. Fan housing, Caleb said, indicating the component he was examining. He kept his voice level, informational. This building has one on every floor. They move air in and out. This one's been running a little warm. Leo looked at the panel. He didn't speak. Caleb didn't expect him to or require him to. He just continued explaining, not because he thought Leo needed the explanation, but because filling the silence with factual information was less demanding than the kind of conversational space that expected response. "There's a filter behind here," Caleb said, pulling it out slowly. "Gets dirty over time. When it gets too dirty, the fan works harder than it should." Leo crouched down. Not close, still several feet back, but lower, getting a different angle on the panel interior. His head tilted slightly. Caleb held the filter up so it was visible. "See the difference? Clean side, dirty side." Leo looked at it. His right hand, hanging at his side, made a small movement, his index finger drawing a quick curve in the air. There and gone. Caleb saw it. He didn't react to it, didn't point it out or comment on it. He just noted it and went back to the filter. "This one comes out, new one goes in," he said. He set the old filter aside and reached for the replacement in his kit. Same shape, same size, just cleaner. He installed the new filter, closed the panel, ran a brief check. The whole thing took maybe 8 minutes from when Leo had walked in. When he stood up and turned around, Leo was still there, standing with the sun toy in his right hand, watching. "Good," Caleb said, referring to the unit, not requiring any acknowledgement. Leo looked at him. Not a long look, 2 seconds, 3 maybe, and then looked away. But it was a direct look, the kind Victoria had described as rare. D. Park appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking vaguely panicked. "Leo, I'm so sorry." I turned around and He's fine, Caleb said. "He was watching me work." D. Park looked at Leo, then at Caleb, then at Leo again. Is that okay? Did he bother you?" "No," Caleb said. Leo walked back toward D. Park without instruction, which seemed to reassure her. But at the doorway, he stopped for just a moment and looked back at the access panel, the closed, correct, functioning panel, and then walked out. Caleb packed his kit. The air handling unit ran quietly and without complaint. He logged the maintenance visit and moved on to the next item on his list. That evening, Victoria called him. Not an email, the actual direct line she'd put on the card. "D. Park told me about the kitchen," she said. "Yeah," he said. He was sitting at his kitchen table at home, the evening news on low in the background that he wasn't watching. "She said Leo watched you for almost 10 minutes. Something like that." "He doesn't do that with people he doesn't know," Victoria said. Her voice had a careful quality. He especially doesn't stay in a room with someone new who he usually leaves. The panel was interesting to him, Caleb said. I just happened to be the one opening it. Maybe. A pause. D. Park also said you talked to him the whole time, explained what you were doing. I was explaining it to the room, Caleb said. He was in the room. Victoria was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had moved slightly from the careful quality into something more direct. You didn't make him respond. He wasn't obligated to respond. Most people don't understand that, she said. Even people who work with autistic kids professionally. There's always this pressure, this expectation of return, eye contact or a word or some signal that communication is being received. You didn't do that. I wasn't trying to communicate with him, Caleb said. I was doing my job. He was watching. Those are both just facts. She was quiet again for a beat. He drew a sun when he got back to the room, she said. D. Park noticed. On the notepad she keeps on her desk. He picked up a pen and drew a sun and then sat down. Caleb thought about this. Kids draw what's on their mind, he said. What do you think was on his mind? He thought about it honestly. I don't know, he said. Could have been anything. Could have been the fan housing. Could have been the filter. Clean side, dirty side. Could have been just... He paused. Sometimes when a moment is okay, that's what you come back to. The shape of the okay moment. Victoria made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He understood it anyway. He's going to be fine, Caleb said. Not as a platitude. He didn't do platitudes, but as a statement of something he actually believed based on actual evidence. He has things to say. He has a visual language that's specific and consistent and legible if people are watching for it. He's going to find more ways to say more things. That's a process, not an event, but it's happening. How do you know? Not challenging, genuinely asking. Because he stopped in the doorway and looked back at the panel, Caleb said. That's memory formation. He was filing it. Whatever that moment was, he kept it. The quiet on the line had a different quality now. Not processing quiet, something more like the quiet. After attention has been held for a long time, and something that isn't exactly release but is adjacent to it has occurred. Okay, Victoria said, quietly. Send me the revised intake section tomorrow, Caleb said. I want to look at it before the weekend. I will, she said. A pause. Caleb? Yeah. Thank you. Not the formal thanks of professional correspondence, something smaller and more specific. The thanks of someone who means it about a particular thing. Sure, he said. He turned the TV off after the call and sat in the quiet of his kitchen for a while. Outside, the city was doing its evening things. Traffic thinning as the hour moved toward 10, a dog barking 2 blocks over, the distant sound of a train. His apartment was not large, and it was not decorated in any particular way, and the kitchen table had a ring on it from a coffee cup that had been there for 3 years because he'd never gotten around to addressing it. He sat at that table and thought about Owen at 4 in the same kitchen, the same table, before the ring, running a toy car back and forth across the surface, making a sound with his mouth. That was not an engine sound, but was a very specific sound that Caleb had taken 3 weeks to understand was Owen's way of counting. The car went back. The sound went up. The car went forward. The sound went down. Back and forward, up and down. A numerical system that existed only in the space between Owen's mind and the motion of a toy car on a kitchen table. Caleb had not understood it for 3 weeks. And then one afternoon he had, and the understanding had landed with a weight that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but was somewhere in the complicated territory between them. The territory that held all the things you realized you had been missing and the relief of not missing them anymore. He sat in his kitchen and thought about the framework sitting in his email, still half-formed but more right than it had been a month ago, getting more right in each draft. He thought about Leo in the kitchen doorway, looking back at the closed panel, filing the moment. He thought about all the families who were sitting in their own version of his 2005 driveway right now. Engine off, child sleeping in the back seat, the weight of new knowledge and the gap between yet and never, feeling enormous in the silence. He hoped the thing they were building would reach some of them. He went to bed at 11 and slept reasonably well, which had not always been a given, and which he'd learned to appreciate without attaching too much significance to it. The foundation had a name by December. Victoria had gone through 11 options over the course of 3 weeks, which Caleb knew because she'd sent him each iteration with a brief note explaining her reasoning and a shorter note explaining why she'd rejected the previous one. He hadn't been asked to weigh in on the naming, which was fine, that wasn't his domain, but she'd included him anyway, and he'd understood this as her way of keeping the thread of the thing continuous, making sure the person who'd started it with her was still present in the decisions, even when those decisions weren't directly his to make. The name she landed on was the Sundial Foundation, not the Sun Foundation, which had been option 4 and which he'd privately liked but hadn't said so. Not the Leo Foundation, which had been option 7 and which Victoria had rejected herself within 24 hours because, as she'd written in the follow-up note, it wasn't about Leo specifically. It was about all the kids like Leo and all the parents like her and all the mornings where the communication was happening and nobody was reading it. Sundial, she'd written in her explanation, because a sundial tells time through shadow and light, through what's cast and what's received, and because it only works if you know how to read it. Caleb had read that explanation sitting in his truck in the parking structure at 6:50 in the morning and had sat with it for a moment before starting the engine. He didn't tell her he liked it. He sent back a message that said, "That works," which was, for him, significant enthusiasm. The legal structure came together in January, which was faster than he'd expected and apparently slower than Victoria's lawyers had told her it would be, based on the tone of the email she sent him on the 14th of the month. Incorporation complete. 3 weeks behind their estimate. I've noted this for future reference. Caleb didn't know what future reference meant in this context and decided not to ask. He'd continued his work at Hargrove Tower through all of it. Every morning, the badge on his left pocket. Every morning, the work order list and the coffee from the sublevel machine and the quiet movement through the building that no longer groaned at him from the elevator cable because he'd fixed that in October and it had stayed fixed. The building had its winter problems, heating system calibrations, a pipe that froze briefly on the exterior wall of the 4th floor during the cold snap in November, a condensation issue on the windows of the lobby that required a slightly more involved solution than he'd initially diagnosed. He solved them in order, logged them properly, moved to the next one. Marcus had figured out the consulting arrangement by November, which was inevitable. Caleb hadn't hidden it, just hadn't announced it. And eventually the combination of his occasional early morning presence on 37 and the existence of a document in the building's visitor log that said, Sinclair Capital Group, private meeting, Caleb Dawson had been enough for Marcus to add it up. He'd called Caleb into his office, a small windowless room near the loading dock that smelled permanently of coffee and machinery, and sat across from him with the specific expression of a man trying to decide which category a thing belonged in. "You're consulting for Sinclair," Marcus said. "On a non-profit project," Caleb said. "Not building-related. Outside my regular hours." "That's technically a conflict of interest disclosure situation." "I disclosed it to HR in October," Caleb said. "There's a form. I submitted it." Marcus blinked. He hadn't known about the form. "Oh. Is there something you need from me specifically?" Caleb asked. Not challenging. Genuinely asking. Marcus looked at him for a moment. "No," he said. Then, after a pause, "Is it the autism thing? The thing with her kid in the lobby?" "Related to that, yeah." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He had a daughter. Caleb knew this the way you know things about people you've worked alongside for years, not from direct conversation, but from the accumulated small details. The daughter was in her mid-20s. He didn't know anything else about her. "Good," Marcus said finally. That's a good thing to do with your time." He looked at his desk. "Don't let it affect your work here." "It hasn't," Caleb said. "I know it hasn't," Marcus said, in a tone that acknowledged this was the point. "Just saying." Caleb went back to work. The consulting sessions had evolved by then into something more structured than they'd started as. They met twice a week, Tuesday evenings, usually at a coffee place 2 blocks from the tower that stayed open late and had a back corner that was quiet enough to work in. And Saturday mornings at the office space Victoria had leased for the foundation's preliminary operations, which was not in Hargrove Tower, but in a smaller building across town. deliberately separate from the corporate infrastructure. She'd been clear about that separation early on. The foundation was not a Sinclair Capital project. It was not a PR initiative. It was not going to share letterhead or staff or lobby space with the corporation, because the moment it did, the people it was supposed to serve would smell the institutional distance from a mile away. Caleb had agreed with that. It had made him trust the whole enterprise slightly more. The foundation office was on the second floor of a converted brick building that had been a textile warehouse in a previous life and still had the bones of it. High ceilings, wide plank floors, windows that were large enough to fill the space with real light rather than the engineered approximation of it. Victoria had hired an interior consultant to help with the physical space design, and Caleb had sat in on 2 of those meetings to flag things from a sensory standpoint: the lighting temperature, the acoustic properties of the flooring, the color palette, the arrangement of furniture that allowed for both proximity and easy exit. He was not an expert on this. He knew what had mattered to Owen and what he'd learned from that experience, which was not the same as expertise but was not nothing. The consultant, a woman named Petra, who had worked on similar projects before and knew far more than Caleb about the clinical dimensions of sensory-friendly design, had listened to what he said and pushed back on some of it and incorporated the rest, and the result was somewhere between what he'd described and what she'd proposed, which seemed right. Things built by only one perspective rarely held up. It was in one of those Saturday morning sessions in February that the curriculum argument happened. Caleb had seen it coming for about 3 weeks. The parent education program, the core of what he'd described in Victoria's office 6 months earlier, the piece he'd told her was the thing itself, had been going through draft revisions with an advisory committee that Victoria had assembled in January. The committee was good. 3 researchers in developmental psychology, 2 occupational therapists with long experience in family support, 1 autistic adult advocate who had the most useful perspective in the room and the least institutional authority, and a former school administrator who understood systems and funding structures in ways that the others didn't. The drafts coming out of the committee were thorough and well-researched, and gradually becoming something that looked more like a clinical manual than a parent education program. Caleb had said this in the weekly review in January, and it had generated a polite but real debate that hadn't been fully resolved. The committee chair, Dr. Renata Walsh, a developmental psychologist from the university whose work Victoria Baum had found in her initial research, had maintained that rigor was not the same as clinical distance, and that the program needed to be grounded in evidence if it was going to be taken seriously by funders and partner organizations. She wasn't wrong. Caleb knew she wasn't wrong. That was the thing that made it a real argument rather than a simple one. He'd spent the first 2 weeks of February reading the latest draft and marking it up in a way he suspected was going to require a conversation rather than tracked changes in a document. He'd been right. Victoria had read his comments before the Saturday session. He knew this because she'd sent him a message at 11:15 Friday night that said, "I've read everything. Let's talk tomorrow." The lateness of the message told him something about how she'd spent her Friday evening, which told him something about how seriously she was taking the problem. He arrived at the foundation office at 9 Saturday morning. Victoria was already there. She was almost always already there, with coffee from an actual coffee place rather than a machine, which she'd started bringing to the Saturday session sometime in November. He'd stopped making a point of not noticing this. She handed him a cup, and they sat across from each other at the long work table in the main room with the marked-up draft between them. "Tell me what you told the document," she said, which was her way of asking him to say the difficult part out loud so they could look at it directly. "The program is becoming about autism," Caleb said. "It started as a program about parents. There's a difference." Victoria was quiet, listening. "Everything in here is evidence-based and technically accurate," he said. "The section on sensory processing, the section on communication development, the behavioral frameworks, all of it is solid. Dr. Walsh is right that it needs to be rigorous. I'm not arguing against that." He paused. "But a parent sitting in that room on the first day isn't there to learn about autism. They're there because they're scared and they love their kid and they don't understand what's happening and they need someone to start from where they actually are, not from where the research literature is." "And where are they actually?" Victoria said. "They're in my driveway in 2006, Caleb said. "Engine off. Kid asleep in the back, trying to figure out what to do with the weight of it. She didn't say anything for a moment. They don't need a manual in week 1, Caleb said. They need someone to say, your kid is communicating. Right now, today, they are communicating, and here's how to start reading it. The manual comes later. The manual is useful later. But the first thing, the thing that changes how a parent walks back into their house after the first session, has to be about their specific child. Not autism as a category. Victoria looked at the draft. Dr. Walsh is going to push back on individualization at scale. She's going to say that a program that's too child-specific isn't replicable. I know, Caleb said. And she's not wrong about the replication problem. She's not wrong, Caleb agreed. But there's a version of replicable that doesn't mean identical. You can build a framework that teaches parents how to observe their specific child without prescribing what they'll find. The skill is the observation. The content of the observation is always going to be different. He looked at her. That's what I did in the lobby. I didn't know Leo. I didn't know what he needed specifically. What I knew was how to look, where to look, what signals mattered. That's teachable without knowing the specific kid in advance. Victoria picked up a pen. She held it without writing, thinking. So the curriculum teaches the skill of looking, and the child-specific part develops through the looking. Yes, Caleb said. She wrote something in the margin of the draft, then looked up. I need you to say this to Dr. Walsh directly. I can relay it, but it'll be more useful coming from you. Caleb looked at her. She doesn't have a lot of patience for non-credentialed input. I know, Victoria said. She doesn't have a lot of patience for anything that isn't peer-reviewed. That's part of what makes her good, and part of what makes her frustrating. She paused. But she's been listening more than it looks like. She asks me questions about your comments after every review. She doesn't phrase them as questions about your comments. She phrases them as her own curiosity about the material, but they're consistently aligned with what you've written. Caleb absorbed this. When's the next committee meeting? Thursday. I'll come, he said. He did, and the Thursday meeting was exactly as uncomfortable as he'd expected, and probably as useful. Dr. Walsh was in her mid-50s, compact and precise, with the particular quality of someone who had spent a career defending the value of rigorous thinking against the encroachment of anecdote, and who had, over that career, occasionally overcorrected. She listened to Caleb with an expression of careful neutrality that did not conceal as much skepticism as she probably intended. He made his case without hedging it, because hedging it would have given her an easy target. He said the thing about teaching the skill of looking rather than the map of what to find. He said the thing about the driveway. He said the thing about Leo on the lobby floor drawing the shape of what he needed, and the room full of expertise that was looking at the wrong place. When he was done, the room was quiet for a moment. The skill-based framing has merit, Dr. Walsh said, in the tone of someone granting more than they'd planned to. The question is how you assess it. How do you measure whether a parent has learned to observe their child effectively versus learned to perform the language of observation? You don't measure it in week 1, Caleb said. You measure it in week 6. You have parents bring something specific, a moment they noticed, a behavior they'd previously dismissed, something small their kid does that they've started to read differently. Not a clinical report. Just, what did you see and what did you do with it? Dr. Walsh looked at him. That's an assessment model. It's a conversation, Caleb said. The assessment comes from the conversation. She was quiet for another moment. Then she wrote something on her notepad, fast, in the way she wrote when something had engaged her actual attention rather than her professional courtesy. I want to work through the week 1 structure with this framework in mind, she said. Not commit to it. Work through it. That's all I'm asking, Caleb said. After the meeting, in the hallway outside, the autistic adult advocate on the committee, a man named James who was in his early 30s and had been the most quietly useful person in every meeting Caleb had attended, fell into step beside him. You said the right thing in there, James said. She's not convinced, Caleb said. She's thinking about it, which for Renata is the same thing, James said. Give her 2 weeks. He paused. The thing you said about the driveway. The engine off, kid in the back seat. I've heard parents describe that. My mom described that actually when I asked her once what it was like when I was first diagnosed. He looked at the floor briefly. She said the hardest part wasn't the diagnosis itself. It was the gap between knowing something and knowing what to do with it. Yeah, Caleb said. That's the gap the program fills, James said. If it does what you're describing, that specific gap. That's what it needs to do, Caleb said. Whether we're building it right is the question. James looked at him with the particular directness that Caleb had noticed in him consistently. The way he looked at things without the social overlay that most people couldn't turn off. You're building it right, he said. You're just building it slowly, which is different. Caleb thought about this for the rest of the day. The spring brought complications that nobody had fully planned for, because that was what springs did. The lease on the foundation space came up for renegotiation in March, and the landlord increased the term substantially, which led to 3 weeks of back and forth that Victoria handled with a calm that Caleb suspected was partially performance and partially genuine. She'd negotiated large-scale contracts her whole professional life, and a lease dispute was, in the architecture of the problem she'd faced, not particularly large. The foundation got the space at a rate that was higher than before, but lower than the landlord's opening position, and Victoria wrote it off as a workable outcome without visibly dwelling on it. In April, a local news outlet ran a piece on the Sundial Foundation in their nonprofit spotlight section. A short article, not front page, but enough to generate an influx of inquiry emails that Dee Park, who had shifted a portion of her time to foundation work at Victoria's request, spent a week processing. Most of the inquiries were from families, parents of newly diagnosed children, parents of older children who'd been in the system for years and felt like something was still not connecting. A few from teachers, one from a pediatrician who wanted to know if there was a referral pathway in development. Caleb read through a batch of the family inquiries on a Friday evening and had to put his phone down after the 7th one because the accumulation of them was doing something to him he hadn't expected. Not sentimentally, he was not a sentimental person, or was one only in ways he didn't make visible. Just the weight of recognition, the specific recurring weight of reading what his own experience looked like from the outside, in the words of people who were currently in the middle of it. He picked the phone back up and read the rest. He forwarded 6 of them to Victoria with a note that said, "These families specifically, before the program launches, if there's a way to connect them to early resources now." She replied within an hour. Already on it, Dee Park is reaching out Monday. He put the phone down and made dinner and called Owen and told him about the article, which Owen had already found himself and read in full. "They quoted you," Owen said. "One line," Caleb said. He'd been interviewed for the piece and had said approximately 4 sentences, of which one had been used. The goal is to teach parents how to look. Everything else comes from that. He'd read it in print and felt the small, slightly uncomfortable experience of his own words in someone else's publication, attributed to his name. "It's a good line," Owen said. "It was the least I could say without sounding like I didn't want to talk to the reporter," Caleb said. Owen made a sound that might have been a laugh in a different person. "Is the center almost ready?" "Getting there," Caleb said. "Probably fall. October, maybe." "Will you teach there?" Caleb considered how to answer that. He'd been considering it for several months, in the background, without coming to a conclusion. The consulting had been manageable alongside his regular work. Teaching, running actual sessions, being present in a room with parents in the way he'd been in the room with Owen for years, was a different level of involvement. "I don't know," he said honestly. "You should," Owen said. Not as pressure. Just as a statement of what Owen thought was true, delivered with the same flat certainty he brought to everything he believed, which meant it was worth taking seriously. "I'll think about it," Caleb said. "You've been thinking about it," Owen said. "You've been thinking about it since October." "How do you know that?" "Because you mention it without mentioning it," Owen said. "Every time we talk about the foundation, you talk about the curriculum and the sessions and what the parents will need, and you never say I or me in those sentences. You say the program, the facilitators, the approach. But what you're describing is what you would do if you were in the room." Caleb sat with this for a moment. Owen had been doing this since he was about 16, identifying the thing Caleb was actually saying underneath the thing Caleb was saying. and it had never entirely stopped being startling. "That's very perceptive," Caleb said. "I know," Owen said, flatly. "Are you going to answer the question?" I said, "I'll think about it." "You said you'll think about it," Owen acknowledged, which was Owen's way of noting that this was not the same as answering. He raised it with Victoria in May, which took him longer to get to than it should have because raising it meant accepting the possibility of a yes, which meant a significant change to his life, which he did not approach casually. He brought it up on a Tuesday evening at the coffee place, after they'd worked through the revised Week 3 session structure, and he'd given her his thoughts on the family intake form that Dr. Walsh's team had been revising since the Thursday meeting. "I've been thinking about whether I should facilitate some of the parent sessions directly," he said. "Not preamble, not throat clearing, just the thing itself." Victoria looked up from the document she'd been reading. She had the expression of someone who had been waiting for this particular sentence for several months and had made a conscious decision not to prompt it. "And?" she said. "And I think I should," he said. "Probably not all of them, but the first session and a few of the others, the ones where the frame gets established, the ones where a parent needs to hear from someone who was in the same room they're currently in." "Yes," Victoria said. "I haven't finished." "You said the thing that mattered," she said. "The rest is logistics." He looked at her. "The logistics matter." "They do," she agreed. "And we'll work through them. But the yes isn't contingent on the logistics." She looked at him steadily. "I've been watching how you talk about the curriculum for 6 months. You talk about it the way you talked about your work order in the lobby, like you already know what needs to happen and you're just solving for the most efficient path to get there. The facilitation is the thing that needs to happen. Everything else is path." Caleb looked at his coffee. He didn't argue with this. "I'll need to adjust my schedule with Marcus." "Talk to Marcus," she said. "He'll probably say it's fine." "He'll definitely say it's fine," Victoria said. "Victoria. He told me at the building owners meeting in February that you were, and I'm quoting directly, the most competent person in the building by a distance and probably in the running for the city." Caleb stared at her. "Marcus said that." "Marcus said that? To you?" "To a room of 12 building owners, of whom I was one." She looked faintly amused, which on Victoria was a subtle thing, a slight shift at the corner of her mouth that people who didn't know her would probably miss. "He was making a point about undervalued trades work, I think, but he used you as the example." Caleb thought about Marcus in his small, windowless office saying that's a good thing to do with your time. He thought about the 12 years of work orders, the elevator cable, the frozen pipe, the flickering light on the 8th floor that nobody else could find the source of. "I'll talk to him," he said. Victoria nodded, and they went back to the documents, and the Tuesday session ended the way they usually ended, with a list of items for the next session and a clear sense of what the week's work was. He drove home through the city, which was in its May mode, warm enough to have the window down, long enough daylight that 9 o'clock still had some color in the sky to the west. He was 3 blocks from his apartment when his phone rang through the speakers. The contact name said Owen. "It's Tuesday," Caleb said. "We don't usually talk Tuesdays." "I know," Owen said. "I just wanted to—" He paused, which was unusual for Owen. Owen generally either had something to say or didn't call. "I finished another puzzle today, the one with the harbor. The big one." "How many pieces?" 2,000. Caleb made a sound of acknowledgement. "How long?" 9 days. I started the water sections first instead of the border." Caleb smiled at the road ahead. "Why?" "I wanted to try a different approach," Owen said. "See if it worked better." "Did it?" A pause. "No, border is still better, then in a slightly different register. But I needed to find that out myself." Caleb drove through an intersection, the light green, the city moving around him in its late evening way. "Yeah," he said. "You did." They were quiet for a moment, the comfortable quiet of a phone call between 2 people who didn't need to fill all the space. "Dad," Owen said. Rarely. He used it rarely, which meant it always registered. "The foundation, the thing you're building." "Yeah." "Is it going to help people like me? When I was little?" Caleb thought about the 7 families he'd read the inquiry emails from, the weight of recognition in each one. He thought about the curriculum he'd spent 6 months helping to build from the ground up on the principle that a child is always communicating, and the only question is whether the people around them know how to look. He thought about the first session he'd agreed to facilitate himself, the room he'd be standing in when fall came, with parents who were sitting in the same place he'd sat 17 years ago. "That's the idea," he said. Owen was quiet for a beat. "Good," he said. "Just that." The city moved around the truck. The harbor was somewhere to the east, invisible from here, but present. The water that connected this city to the larger world, dark and constant and indifferent to what happened on its edges. And somewhere across town, a 21-year-old was looking at a completed 2,000-piece puzzle of it and deciding that border first was still the right approach, even if you needed to find that out the hard way. Caleb pulled into his building's parking lot and sat in the truck for a moment after the engine went off. Not for any particular reason, just because the day had been a long one, and the moment before getting out of the car was sometimes the last moment of the day that was entirely his. He thought about October. He thought about a room full of parents, first session, the gap between knowing something and knowing what to do with it. He thought about what he'd say in that room and how he'd start. He knew how he'd start. He'd start with the driveway, engine off, kid in the back seat, the silence of a new weight settling. He'd say, "You're not here because something is wrong with your child. You're here because you love your child and you want to understand them. Those are different things. Everything we do here starts from that difference." And then he'd say, "We're going to learn how to look." He got out of the truck. He went inside. The apartment was the same as it always was. Not large, not decorated in any particular style. The coffee ring on the kitchen table that had been there for 3 years and was going to be there for at least a few more. He poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the city in the dark. The lights of other buildings, other windows, other lives happening simultaneously in all directions. He was tired in the way that felt earned. That was a different kind of tired from the other kinds, and he knew the difference by now. He went to bed. The first session at the Sundial Foundation happened on a Thursday morning in October, which felt accidental but probably wasn't. Victoria had a way of making things that looked incidental turn out to have been considered. 11 families, 11 different versions of the same weight, carried in different ways, visible in different places. Some of them had been waiting for months since the inquiry, emails in the spring. Others had come through referrals from the pediatric network that Dr. Walsh had helped build over the summer. One family had driven 4 hours because there was nothing closer that looked like this. Caleb had walked into that room at 8:45, 15 minutes before anyone arrived, the same way he walked into any space he was responsible for, checking it first, making sure what was supposed to be there was there and what wasn't supposed to be there wasn't. The room was good. Petra had done good work with the space, the lighting warm and adjustable, the seating arranged in a loose circle rather than classroom rows. No fluorescent buzz, acoustic panels on the walls that softened the sound without making it feel padded. A table along one wall with coffee and water, and nothing too complicated. Windows on the east side letting in real morning light. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment, just stood. He thought about what James had said in the hallway after the committee meeting. "You're building it right. You're just building it slowly." He thought about Dr. Walsh's notepad, the fast writing, the way she'd shifted the week 1 structure after the Thursday meeting and sent him the revision with a note that said, in full, "You were right about the entry point. Don't make a thing of it." He thought about Owen saying border is still better, but I needed to find that out myself. He set his jacket over the back of a chair and waited for the families to arrive. They came in the way people come into unfamiliar spaces, tentative, reading the room, deciding where it was safe to be. A mother with a 4-year-old boy balanced on her hip who was looking at the ceiling lights with the particular focused attention of someone cataloging something important. A father who came alone and sat in the chair nearest the door with his arms crossed, not hostile, just a man who'd learned to be ready to leave. 2 parents together, the mother holding a folder of documents that Caleb recognized immediately, the kind of folder that families assemble when they're trying to demonstrate their seriousness, the medical records and school reports and therapy notes that say, "We have done the work, please take us seriously." He knew what that folder cost to put together. Not in money. In the particular labor of convincing systems to see your child. He greeted each family simply. Name, handshake, or nod, depending on what the person seemed to want. A gesture toward the seating. No orientation speech yet. No program overview. He'd learned from working in this building for 6 years that how you started a space mattered more than what you said in it. People read the first 5 minutes and decide whether they're safe, and no amount of well-crafted content overrides an unsafe first 5 minutes. When everyone had settled, he sat down himself, in the circle, not at the front of a room, and he looked around at them without starting immediately. He let the room exist for a moment. The child on the mother's hip had stopped looking at the lights and was now watching Caleb with the open, undisguised assessment of a 4-year-old who hadn't yet learned to make his attention polite. Caleb looked back at him, not performing warmth, just acknowledging. The boy pressed his face briefly against his mother's shoulder, then looked back. Caleb stayed where he was. "I'm going to start with something," Caleb said to the room, "that isn't on any agenda or in any of the materials you were sent. I'm going to start with a question, and I want you to think about the honest answer rather than the right answer." He paused. "What did you tell yourself on the way here this morning about whether this was going to help?" The room was quiet. Then the father by the door uncrossed his arms slowly, not speaking yet, but a change. The mother with the folder looked at her hands. "I told myself probably not," she said, quietly, "because we've tried a lot of things." Caleb nodded. "That's honest," he said. "Thank you." Others spoke. The range was what he'd expected: skepticism, exhaustion, the specific hope that people carry when they've been disappointed enough times that hope starts to look like a liability. The father by the door said he was there because his wife had asked him to come, and he'd run out of better reasons to say no. He said it bluntly, without apology, and Caleb thanked him for saying it and didn't make anything more of it. And then Caleb told them about his driveway. Not the full version. He wasn't there to use the room as a confessional, just enough. Engine off, kid in the back, the weight of new knowledge and the gap between yet and never. He told them he'd been 22 and alone and had no particular expertise and had spent the first weeks reading the wrong things before he found the right things, and that the right things turned out to be less about clinical frameworks and more about the specific patient practice of watching his specific son. He said, "Your child is communicating right now, today, in ways you might not be reading yet. This program is not about fixing your child. It's about learning the language they're already speaking." He said, "We're going to learn how to look." The mother with the folder looked up. Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, not a movie moment release of tension, just a small recalibration, the way a body shifts when it's been braced against something and the something changes. The father by the door had his arms in his lap now. It was not a perfect session. Caleb stumbled over his phrasing twice in the second half and had to restate things. One family had to leave early because their child, who was in the adjacent play space with 2 trained support staff, had a hard morning and needed them. The session ran 12 minutes over time, which Caleb noted and adjusted for in the second week. But the 11 families left with something. He could see it in how they moved out of the room compared to how they'd come in. Not fixed, not transformed, just slightly differently oriented toward the problem they were each carrying, which was the most anyone could reasonably accomplish in 2 hours on a Thursday morning in October. Dr. Walsh had observed from the back of the room. She'd sat quietly for the full session, notepad open, and she'd stayed after everyone else left while Caleb stacked chairs back against the wall and straightened the table. "The driveway story?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "That's the entry point," she said. "That specific story. It does in 3 minutes what our introduction section tries to do in 8 pages. 8 pages is too long," he said. 8 pages is too long, she agreed. This from Dr. Walsh was the equivalent of a significant concession, and they both understood that without saying it. "I want to redesign the written materials to complement the spoken session rather than substitute for it. Can you walk me through what you chose to say versus what you chose to leave out?" They sat down at the table and worked through it. She took notes in the fast, specific way she wrote when something was real. They disagreed on 2 points and resolved one of them and left the other open for the next revision. It was not particularly warm, the collaboration, but it was productive in the way that productive things often aren't particularly warm, and warmth was not what the families needed from the curriculum. They needed it to be right. Victoria had been in the building that morning, but not in the room. Caleb had told her before the session that he thought she shouldn't observe the first one, not because he didn't want her there, but because the families didn't know her role yet, and the presence of the foundation's founder in the room on the first day would change the temperature of it in ways he couldn't fully predict or manage. She'd accepted this without argument, which he'd noticed. He found her in the small office off the main corridor after Dr. Walsh left. She was at her desk with the laptop open, doing the work of running a foundation, emails, funding documents, communications with the advisory committee, the administrative density that surrounded every substantial thing and had to be managed by someone. She looked up when he came in. "How was it?" she said. He sat down across from her and thought about the honest answer versus the right answer, which was the same question he'd asked the families. "It was what it was supposed to be," he said. "Not more than that. Not yet. But the direction is right." "The direction is right," he said. "We have 11 families who left with a slightly different frame than they arrived with. That's week 1. Week 6 is when we'll know something more." She nodded. She had a quality he'd come to rely on over the past year. She didn't require him to perform optimism. She wanted accurate assessments, even when they were complicated, and she'd built enough trust to hear them without flinching. "The father who sat by the door," she said. D. Park had given her a brief summary. How was he at the end? Caleb thought about the uncrossed arms. The man sitting in his chair at the end of the session with a stillness that was different from the stillness he'd arrived with. "He stayed to ask me a question," Caleb said, after everyone else had left. "He asked me how long it took before I felt like I actually understood Owen." "What did you say?" "I said it wasn't a line you crossed. It was a practice. Some days further along than others." He paused. He thought about that for a while, and then said okay, and left. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "That's something." "Yeah," Caleb said. "It's something." The weeks moved forward the way the rest of the year had. Not smoothly, not without friction, but forward. Week 3 brought a conflict between 2 of the curriculum components that required a Saturday session to resolve. Week 4 brought the news that a second cohort of families had already filled, which meant the spring program needed to be planned before the fall one was finished. Week 5 brought a funding inquiry from a regional children's health organization that Victoria handled through 3 meetings and 1 significant compromise, and ultimately accepted as a partnership rather than a grant, because the difference between those 2 things mattered in ways that weren't always visible until they weren't visible too late. Caleb ran the sessions. Not all of them. There were 2 other facilitators by then, both parents of autistic children, both people he'd been involved in identifying and training over the summer. But he ran the first session of each cohort and several of the later ones, and he ran them the same way every time. Starting in the room 15 minutes early, checking the space, sitting in the circle rather than standing at the front, beginning with the honest answer versus the right answer, the driveway. We're going to learn how to look. He still worked at Hargrove Tower. He'd thought about whether that made sense and decided it did, at least for now, for reasons he hadn't fully articulated even to himself, but that had something to do with the importance of the ordinary continuing alongside the extraordinary. The building still had its problems. A new HVAC issue on the 19th floor in November. A leak in the parking structure in December that turned out to have been developing slowly for 2 years and required a more involved repair than the initial assessment suggested. He fixed them. He logged them. He drank the mediocre coffee from the sub-level machine and ate his lunch at 12:15 in the break room and moved through the floors in the quiet way that he'd been moving through them for 6 years. Carlos at the front desk had started calling him something he didn't ask to be called, which was the legend, delivered in a tone that was 60% genuine and 40% ironic, and which Caleb responded to by ignoring it consistently enough that Carlos had started doing it more rather than less, because Carlos was 24 and found this funny. Marcus had adjusted Caleb's schedule to allow for the foundation sessions without drama or significant discussion. He'd done it with the same flat efficiency with which he handled most operational decisions, and the only additional thing he'd said was, "You should take the parking validation for the foundation building. I'll add it to your building perks." Caleb hadn't asked why Marcus knew where the foundation building was. He suspected Carlos. Owen visited the foundation in November. Not a scheduled visit, not announced. He called on a Saturday morning and said he was going to be in that part of the city in the afternoon for a library conference, and did Caleb want to meet for lunch? And Caleb had said yes, and then mentioned that the foundation office was nearby, and would Owen want to see it? And Owen had said yes in the particular direct way that meant he actually wanted to, not the social yes that some people deployed when they were unsure. They ate lunch at a place near the foundation building that Owen chose because it had a menu he could read completely online in advance, which he did, and then ordered the same thing he'd seen on the website without deviation, which Caleb had long ago accepted as one of the more efficient approaches to ordering food that existed. They sat in a booth by the window and talked about the library conference, which was on cataloging systems and which Owen had opinions about, and about the puzzle Owen had started the previous week, a new one, 3,000 pieces, aerial photograph of a city at night. "Border first?" Caleb said. "Border first," Owen said. "Always." After lunch, they walked to the foundation building. Caleb used his key on the weekend lock and took Owen through the space, the main room, the family intake area, the small play space designed for children during parent sessions, the office. Owen moved through it at his own pace, which was deliberate and observational, stopping at things that interested him and passing through things that didn't, without social performance in either direction. He stopped longest in the main session room. He stood in the middle of it for almost a minute, looking at the circle of chairs, the warm lighting, the acoustic panels on the walls. "This is where you do it," he said. "Yeah," Caleb said. Owen looked around the room. He turned slowly, taking in all of it, the way he'd taken in the harbor puzzle, methodically, from edge to center. "It feels like the right kind of room," he said. "What does that mean?" Caleb asked. Not challenging, genuinely curious. "It feels like a room where someone thought about what the people in it would need," Owen said. "Not just what would look good from the outside." He looked at the window. "A lot of rooms aren't like that." Caleb looked at the room he'd been in dozens of times and tried to see it fresh, through Owen's eyes, through the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime reading spaces the way other people read faces. "No," he said. "A lot of rooms aren't." Owen sat down in one of the circle chairs, just sat for a moment in the quiet of the empty room. Caleb sat down across from him, and they were in the circle together, the two of them, which was not a thing Caleb had planned or anticipated, and which landed with a weight he didn't have a name for immediately. "When I was little," Owen said, to the room rather than to Caleb directly, "and I was having a hard time, and when everything was too much, I always knew when you were close, even if you weren't saying anything, even if you weren't doing anything." He paused. "I knew because of how the air changed. You'd come into the room and just be there. And that mattered. That was the thing that mattered." Caleb sat with this for a moment. He thought about the sub-level break room at Hargrove Tower, the mediocre coffee, the work order list. He thought about his 22-year-old self in a driveway with the engine off and a weight settling. "I didn't always know what I was doing," he said. "I know," Owen said. "Neither did I. We figured it out the same way." "Slowly," Caleb said. "Slowly," Owen agreed. A pause. "But we did." The room held the quiet between them. Outside, the city was doing its Saturday afternoon things. Foot traffic on the sidewalk below, a car horn somewhere 2 blocks east, a kid on a bicycle visible through the window for 1 second and then gone. The ordinary world, indifferent as always, continuing. Owen stood up eventually, and they left the building and walked back toward the train station where Owen would catch his ride home. At the corner, Owen stopped. "Dad," he said. Caleb looked at him. 21 years old and taller than Caleb by half an inch, which had happened when Owen was 17, and which Caleb had noted and then adjusted to. He had his mother's jaw and Caleb's eyes and a way of standing that was entirely his own. Straight, but not rigid. Present, but not performing presence. "The families," Owen said. "The ones coming through the program. The ones in those chairs." "Yeah." "You heard him," Owen said. "That boy in the lobby, Leo." He held Caleb's gaze in the direct, undeflected way that had been Owen's way since he was old enough to hold anyone's gaze. "You heard him because of me. Because of everything you learned when you didn't know you were learning it. He paused. That means every hard night mattered. Every time you got it wrong and tried again. Every time you sat in my room and just stayed. A pause, shorter. It mattered. All of it mattered. Caleb stood on the corner of a city street on a Saturday afternoon in November and looked at his son and did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that was smaller than what had just been said, and saying something smaller would have been the wrong choice. Yeah, he said finally. It did. Owen nodded. Then, I'm going to miss my train. Go, Caleb said. Owen went. Caleb watched him walk down the block, that straight, unhurried walk, headphones going in, hands in his jacket pockets, the particular self-containment of a person who had built his life around knowing exactly what he needed and making sure he had it. He watched until Owen turned the corner and was gone. He stood on the sidewalk for another moment. The city moved around him, the ordinary machinery of a Saturday, and he stood in the middle of it and felt the weight of what Owen had said settle into the same place where the other important things had settled over the years. Not loudly, not with ceremony, just permanently. He thought about the 7-year-old on the marble floor, the sun drawn over and over in the silence that everyone else had been too busy to hear. He thought about Victoria sitting on that floor in her expensive suit without hesitation, the small gravitational lean of her son toward her. He thought about 11 families in a circle of chairs on a Thursday morning in October, the honest answer versus the right answer, a father's arms uncrossing slowly. He thought about a filter, clean side and dirty side, a small boy crouching down to see it from a different angle. He walked back toward his truck. The foundation ran its second cohort in the spring, 22 families. The third cohort in the following fall, 31. By the end of the second year, the waiting list was longer than the program could absorb, which became the next problem to solve, which Victoria attacked with the same methodical intensity she brought to every problem that mattered to her. She brought in 2 more facilitators, one of them James, from the advisory committee, who turned out to be exactly as good in a session room as Caleb had thought he might be. She secured a second location across the city in a neighborhood where the gap between need and resources was wider. She negotiated a partnership with the regional school system to offer a version of the parent education component through their special education support structure. None of it went smoothly. There was a funding shortfall in the 14th month that required Victoria to personally cover a gap she hadn't anticipated, which she did without complaint and with visible irritation at herself for not having planned for it better. There was a facilitator who didn't work out. A good person, wrong fit for the specific kind of session work the program required, and the parting was handled carefully, but was still a parting, still uncomfortable, still a thing that had to be done and wasn't fun. There was a board conflict in the spring of the second year over program direction that lasted 6 weeks and left 2 relationships strained in ways that took longer to repair than the conflict itself. Caleb was in the middle of all of it, in the specific way he'd been in the middle of things at Hargrove Tower. Not at the front of it, not running it, but present in the working of it, fixing what could be fixed, flagging what needed attention, occasionally sitting in Dr. Walsh's office for an hour to work through something that was resisting resolution through email. Dr. Walsh had become someone he could have a real conversation with, which had taken time and had not been inevitable. She still had the quality of someone who trusted rigor above most other things, which Caleb had stopped fighting against and started working with, because her rigor was the thing that kept the program from becoming sentimental, from becoming a place where good intentions substituted for good outcomes. He provided the thing she couldn't provide from rigor alone, which was the inside knowledge, the room-level understanding of what a family in crisis actually needed versus what looked like what they needed from the outside. Together, they made the thing better than either of them would have made it separately, which was the best outcome for collaboration and rarer than it should be. Victoria changed. He noticed it over months, not all at once. The way the professional composure that had functioned as the outermost layer of how she moved through the world started to become less the first thing and more one of several things. She was still formidable in the ways that running a major corporation required her to be formidable. She still spoke in the voice that carried authority without effort in boardrooms and investor meetings and the various professional contexts that had always been her native environment. but the underneath of her had more room in it, less held in. She'd started talking about Leo differently, not as a challenge to be managed, but as a person she was genuinely getting to know, with the specific, ongoing, imperfect quality that getting to know another person actually involves. She told Caleb once, in the foundation office on a Tuesday evening in the spring of the second year, that Leo had started telling her things. Not with full sentences. His verbal communication was still developing, still inconsistent, still a combination of words and gesture and the drawn suns that had become his most consistent language. But telling her things. His preferences, his aversions, his observations about the world, conveyed through the combination of channels he had available to him and understood by a mother who had learned, slowly, imperfectly, over time, to read them. He told me he doesn't like the drive to his school, she said, the specific route. He told me by pointing at a turn I usually take and then covering his ears, which is what he does when something is wrong. I'd been taking that route for 2 years. What's on that block? Caleb said. A construction site. Has been for 1.5 years. She looked at him. I didn't know. I drive, he's in the back seat. I'm usually thinking about whatever's next in my day. A pause. I changed the route. How did he respond? He drew a sun on the window on the first morning I took the new route, she said. In the condensation. Just one, very quickly, and then he looked at me in the rearview mirror. Caleb nodded. I said, "Sun," she said, and he went back to looking out the window. She was quiet for a moment. That was enough. For both of us. That was exactly enough. He understood what she meant, not the dramatic breakthrough, not the milestone moment, just a mother and her son in a car, one word, the right route, a sun on a window, the small and sufficient. The day Hargrove Towers Building Management held its annual tenant appreciation event, a thing Caleb had successfully avoided for 5 of the 6 years he'd worked there. Marcus ambushed him in the service corridor on the morning of it and said, with no apparent awareness of irony, "You should come. You're appreciated." Caleb went. He stood at the edge of the lobby in his regular work clothes because he hadn't brought anything else, ate a small plate of food he hadn't been hungry for, and spoke to 3 people he'd never spoken to before despite having maintained the physical infrastructure of their working lives for years. One of them was a senior partner at the law firm on 11, whose water pressure he'd fixed in October of the previous year, who said, unprompted, "You know, someone fixed the water pressure in our kitchen last year, and it was a genuinely significant improvement, in the specific, oblivious way of someone who doesn't connect the person they're speaking to with the person who did the thing they're describing." Caleb said, "Glad it helped," and moved on. Carlos appeared at his elbow approximately 30 seconds later. "That was the water pressure guy," Carlos said, with the barely suppressed delight of someone who'd witnessed this. "I know," Caleb said. "Does he know that's you?" "No." Carlos stared at him. "You're not going to tell him?" "No." "Why not?" Caleb looked at the room. The lobby he'd walked through 6 days a week for 6 years. The marble floors he'd seen a child on in crisis. The elevator bank whose cable he'd repaired in an early morning window before anyone arrived to notice. The room that had been, on one ordinary Thursday, the place where something started that had now reached hundreds of people in ways that had nothing to do with the lobby itself. "Because it doesn't matter if he knows," Caleb said. "The water pressure works. That's the point." Carlos looked at him for a moment with the expression he sometimes got when Caleb said something he was going to repeat to someone else later. "Man," Carlos said. "Okay." On a Sunday in March, 2.5 years after the lobby, Caleb was at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the Foundation's third-year program report, which he'd been going through page by page with a pen in his hand, making notes in the margins in the way he'd learned from Victoria, who'd learned it from her own habit of working directly with documents rather than through summaries. The numbers were good, not perfect. There were metrics that were still below what they'd targeted, a retention rate in the second cohort that had required analysis and adjustment, a cost per family figure that was higher than the model had projected, and that Victoria was working through with the finance committee. But directionally, clearly, unambiguously, the thing was working. 312 families through the program in 2.5 years. Facilitators who were trained and effective and, crucially, were themselves parents who had lived inside the specific experience the program was built around. A curriculum that was now in its fourth revision and was, in Caleb's honest assessment, significantly better than anything he'd have been able to imagine building alone. A waiting list that was, as problems went, the best kind. His phone rang. Owen. "Hey," Caleb said. "Hey." A pause. "Are you doing the report?" "How do you know I'm doing the report?" "Because you do it the first Sunday of March," Owen said. "You've done it the first Sunday of March for 2 years." Caleb looked at the report. He had not been aware that he'd created this pattern. "Yeah," he said. "I'm doing the report." "Is it good?" "It's good," Caleb said. "Mostly." "What's the mostly?" Caleb told him. The retention rate, the cost figure, the places where the numbers were honest about what hadn't worked as well as intended. Owen listened without interrupting, which was Owen's way of listening to things that mattered. When Caleb finished, Owen was quiet for a moment. "But 300 families," Owen said. 312. "That's a lot of driveways," Owen said. Caleb set the pen down. Outside the kitchen window, the March morning was gray in the particular way of late winter gray. The sky the color of something that was thinking about becoming spring but hadn't committed yet. The coffee ring on the kitchen table was still there, 3 years in, permanent now in the way some things become permanent through sheer accumulation of time. "Yeah," Caleb said. "It is." "Dad," Owen said. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you think about the lobby a lot, that day?" Caleb thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," he said. "Not as an event, more as a starting point, a place on the map." He paused. "I think about the floor more than the lobby, the shape he was drawing." "The sun," Owen said. "The sun," Caleb said. A quiet between them, the comfortable Sunday morning quiet they'd been making for years, distance and phone line and the particular warmth of a connection that didn't need architecture to hold itself up. "You heard him," Owen said, quietly. The same words he'd said on the street corner in November 6 months ago. Not a repeat. Something he was returning to because he'd been thinking about it. The way Owen returned to things that mattered and examined them from different angles until he understood them completely. "You heard Leo. And because you heard Leo, Victoria built the foundation. And because the foundation exists, 312 families are in different driveways than they would have been." Caleb didn't say anything. "You heard him because I taught you how to listen," Owen said. "I didn't know I was teaching you. You didn't know you were learning, but that's what happened." A pause. "That's what it was for." Caleb sat at his kitchen table in the gray March morning with the foundation report in front of him and his son's voice in his ear and the coffee ring that had been there for 3 years, and he thought about the accumulation of things. The work orders logged and completed. The elevator cable fixed before anyone knew it was failing. The water pressure working correctly in an office where nobody connected the repair to the person. The year it was hard with Owen, and the year it got better, and the years between then and now that had built themselves into something neither of them had been able to see from the driveway. You don't get to know, when you're in the driveway with the engine off, what the weight you're carrying is going to build into. You can't see it from there. You can only get out of the car. "Yeah," Caleb said. "That's what it was for." Owen said okay, which was Owen's word for enough. Enough said, enough understood, the quiet completion of a thing. Caleb held the phone for another moment after the call ended, the way you hold something you're not quite ready to set down. Then he picked up his pen. He went back to the report. He made his notes in the margins, specific and accurate, the same way he'd always done it, careful enough that someone else could pick up where he left off if needed. Outside, the March sky was shifting. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just the slow, incremental lightening of a morning that was going to become something else by afternoon. The gray giving way in the east to something that was almost, not quite, nearly the beginning of a different season. He kept working.